1. Scott was already feeling sick when their plane landed in the Bahamas. He hoped it was just from the flight. The last thing he wanted was to be sick on their last spring break together. He had too much planned to just spend the week sheltering in his hotel room. The rattling of the plane as they descended was almost enough to make him puke up the in-flight peanuts, making him thankful that he hadn't tried to gulp down a meal like some of the other passengers. If he had, he would have been wearing it by now. Sipping down the last of his ginger ale, he prepared to debark from the plane. He could see his friends already exiting in front of him. For all the planning they'd put into this trip, somehow none of them had gotten seats next to each other. Possibly another reason his stomach was doing flips, reminding himself that flying had never been something he'd been good at. For Scott, it was right up there with long car rides and roller coasters as far as his stomach was concerned. But it was the only way for them to get down here and have the vacation of a lifetime. A vacation that he couldn't afford to not take, since it was going to be the last one he got to take for a while. And possibly the last one they ever got to do as a group. He knew that lots of people kept in touch after college, but he wasn't naive to believe that they all would. Or even that things would be like they were now, once life got in the way. Especially since once they got back to the States, all of them would be darting across the map to start new lives in new cities. Most of them, anyway. His seatmate hadn't been awful, though hearing about the lady next to him's daughter in Wisconsin the entire trip certainly hadn't changed his mind on that. Being mindful of his manners, he still wished her well as they got off. She reminded him to drink water, which made it clear she had a good idea of the debauchery they'd come to the island for. For a reason that he couldn't shake, even as he stepped off the plane, there was the feeling that something was wrong. Even though outside the day was bright and a little too sunny, he felt that a dark black cloud was looming in the distance. He reminded himself that they knew the Caribbean was known for its weird weather, hoping that's all it was. Scott was sweating as soon as the humidity hit him, instantly regretting the thin yellow t-shirt he had on, since it was already starting to show puddles under his pits. Looking around, he saw a man in a suit and tie, cell phone already up to his ear, and gulped. Immediately thinking of the future, he had to look forward to when he got home. The agreement had seemed like a great idea when he'd made it to have his tuition paid, but now it seemed like a social death sentence. The thought of wearing a suit and tie, and working his way up at Hartman and Hartfield, was the closest thing to hell he could think of. But until then it would be him, Andrew, Ashley, Brittany, and their buddy Billy, having the time of their life. Together, they would spend the next week partying on an all-expense-paid adventure. Boating and drinking all around the Bahamas. It would be like freshman year all over again, except hopefully he'd remember more of it, and it wouldn't be in Myrtle Beach. The best part was it would all be on his dad's credit card, which, as his father had loved reminding him when pitching a career as a lawyer, didn't have a limit. Scott's dad had spared no expense for what he called a job well done. On both the trip out here, and for preparing him for his job when he got back home. There was already a week's worth of suits in his size waiting for him for when he gets home. Each of them was dull and gray with high square shoulders, making him look like some parody of an 80s businessman. He wished he could be like his buddy Andrew, who didn't have any plans. The only thing Andrew had going on was spending a couple of months backpacking around Europe. After that, he said he might look for an actual job, depending on if he didn't settle down abroad or do the nomad thing. If Scott had told his dad that he wanted to do that, he'd have probably stroked out. In fact, Andrew wasn't even coming back with them. When they flew back to the States, he was flying straight to Amsterdam. Lucky bastard, Scott thought with a sigh, as he stepped into the slightly air-conditioned airport. The others were waiting for him as he came through customs. Billy, with his curly red hair, was laughing at something on his phone. Along with his luggage, he had a bag from the duty-free. One that clinked together every step he took, with the unmistakable sound of several large bottles of liquor. The heat outside the airport was brutal, and everyone's clothes were getting uncomfortably clingy. For the first time in his life, Scott was envious of the girls' ability to wear short shorts. They seemed a lot less bothered by the heat than the guys did. Even in their Hawaiian shirts and cargo shorts, Scott felt like he might as well be wearing a sweater. "The sooner we get a drink, the better," Andrew told them as they all climbed into a taxi. Billy nodded. "Damn right. I think I'm even going to get in the pool." "Already?" Brittany flipping back an absent strand of blonde hair. "I thought we could walk around first, take in the sights." "You might not have realized it, but we are dying out here," Scott told her, wiping his brow for added effect. "I'd rather sweat in the Bahamas than spend another week in Minnesota any day," Ashley chided, readjusting the straps of her top. "You'll miss it when you're gone," Billy reminded her, suddenly sounding serious, a rarity for him. "Doubt it," Ashley replied. She was about to say something else when their taxi whipped around in and out through the traffic. The rules of the road were a lot different from back home. Here it seemed the bigger vehicle always had the right of way. They were all grateful when he pulled to a stop outside of their hotel. After checking in, the guys were even more grateful for the small bar right next to the building. A smallish, tacky-looking tiki joint that overlooked the white sandy beach. The clear blue water left them all speechless. He'd heard of white sandy beaches before, but this was his first time seeing one, and from everyone else's reaction, Scott was willing to bet it was their first time too. It was a big difference from the icy lakes they had back home. Everything about it looked like something from out of a movie. Scott sighed as he and Andrew entered their room. Inside were 2 double beds and a window facing the parking lot, with a TV that looked it had been new in the 80s. However, it was plenty for the 2 of them. As long as they had beds and a bathroom, they were fine. This trip wasn't for chilling in the room and watching TV anyway. They could do that anytime. The next week was supposed to be about making memories they could never have again. The other rooms were nearby. Ashley and Brittany were right across the hall and Billy was down at the end. Andrew had offered to let Billy stay with them, but he had insisted on getting his own room. Some nonsense about all the tale he was going to pull while he was down here. Scott and Andrew already had bets on the number of nights he went home alone. Scott had $10 that said it would be every night. Andrew had 10 that said someone at the bar would throw him a pity fuck. Those still seemed like long odds to Scott. Ashley was waiting for them when they came out of their room. Seeing her made Scott's stomach flutter. She'd changed from what she was wearing on the plane. Standing in the hall in a red bikini and Daisy Dukes, she looked like a pinup model. "Scott, you good?" she asked him, smiling. Andrew elbowed him. "Huh, what?" he asked her, looking around nervously. She laughed. "You just kind of froze up there for a minute." "I don't know about frozen. Looks like he's running a little too hot to me," Andrew said, laughing. Scott elbowed him back and prayed that he wasn't blushing. "Nope, I'm fine. You guys get settled in all right?" "Yeah, the rooms are better than I thought they would be," she said, taking a peek back inside. "Brittany should be out in a minute." "Does she need any help?" Andrew offered, wiggling his eyebrows at Scott. "Ha ha. Hilarious," Ashley said with her arms crossed. "Yo, let's get fucked up," Billy shouted from the other end of the hall, waving 2 bottles in the air. They all froze for a minute when they saw him. He had changed too. Now he was wearing a drinking hat. A t-shirt that said Female Body Inspector and lime green swim trunks. And beads, lots of beads. Scott couldn't quite find his words as Billy ran up to them, his flip-flops clapping off the tiled floor like a child's. "You guys ready to go down to the bar?" he asked. Ashley's mouth was wide open as she stared at him. "Damn girl, you look good," he told her, making her eyebrows rise even higher. Finally, Andrew broke the silence. "What's with the beads, Billy? You know you throw them to drunk chicks and they show you their tits." He beamed. Scott couldn't keep it in anymore and started laughing. Ashley forgot to be mad and soon joined in. When Brittany came out, the 3 of them were all cracking up. "What, I don't get it?" Billy asked, looking at them. Brittany just shook her head. "Mardi Gras is in New Orleans, you idiot." "What the fuck is Mardi Gras?" he asked, following them all down to the bar. She looked over at Andrew and Scott, who just shrugged. They'd given up on Billy a long time ago. Once downstairs, they exited the hotel and went out again into the harsh light of the sun, and quickly made their way to the bar. Billy had been right about one thing. Drinks were exactly what they'd needed to get back into vacation mode. By his third beer, Scott was feeling all his doubts slip away. Maybe, just maybe, life wouldn't suck so much after all, he thought. He'd just be like everyone else and work his life away just for a single vacation a year. Plenty of people were happy that way, right? The bartender was a very attractive, light-skinned woman with long curly hair. She wore nothing except a bikini and a short jean skirt. Billy was practically drooling on the table by the time they'd started in on a couple of margarita buckets, which were made so strong that Scott cringed on every sip, tasting more Cuervo than margarita mix. "I'm so glad you invited us," Ashley told him with a smile, sipping on her straw and smiling at him. Scott turned away, trying not to blush. "It's nothing. I just thought we should all have one last send-off before graduation. To the last spring break any of us will ever enjoy," Andrew cheered, downing another shot and then shaking his head at the taste. "Speak for yourself," Brittany told them. "I'm going to be a teacher, so I still have that to look forward to." "Because that's a job that's known for fun times," Ashley commented sarcastically. "If you call catching a charge fun," Billy replied, still eyeing the bartender. "Not every teacher sleeps with their students," Brittany chided. "Geez, get your mind out of the gutter." "Speak for yourself," Billy said with a shrug. "We went to different schools," he said, still not looking at any of them. They all refused to take the bait. "All right guys, after these drinks I say we go party for real," Scott told them. "And how do you propose we do that?" Andrew sighed, slamming another one down quickly. Scott laughed and pushed in his chair as he got up. "There's an island Tony told me about. Apparently it's nothing but a bunch of rich people partying their ass off, 24 hours a day." "You mean Sketch Tony?" Andrew asked him. Brittany and Ashley laughed. "What's wrong with Tony?" Billy asked innocently, looking away from the bartender for a moment. "Yes, Sketch Tony," Scott replied, ignoring Billy's question. "But this is for real. I've already talked to the guy before we got here. One of the tourist boat operators near the hotel knows the place and will take us." "For how much?" Andrew asked, figuring they were about to be scammed. Scott shook his head. "Don't worry about it. After all, this is my dad's treat, right?" "I still think this is a shit idea," Andrew told them. "We've got the beach over there," he gestured, "and the bar is right here. What more do we need?" "Horny rich chicks," Billy replied without looking at them. Brittany arched an eyebrow. "Could be cute guys with yachts there too," she offered, as if trying to sway her and Ashley's minds. Scott was already thinking of backpedaling when she said that. The last thing he wanted on their last vacation together was to watch Ashley, the girl of his dreams, spend it with some rich guy on his yacht. "Not really my thing," Ashley said to Scott's relief. "But island hopping does sound fun." "So we're all agreed?" Scott asked. After a minute of silence they all agreed, and before they could change their minds, Scott walked out to the street and hailed a taxi to take them to the marina. He didn't want to miss out on the opportunity to make this the best spring ever. The marina was less than 15 minutes away, but the insane traffic patterns made it feel like they were going to the other side of the island, and made Scott feel like every time he got into a vehicle in this place, he was putting his life in someone else's hands. It was not a good feeling. The actual marina was run-down looking. Though being fair, he expected that anything not owned by the hotels was going to look that way. "Are we in the right place?" Billy asked, as they walked past rusted fishing trawlers filled with hard-eyed men restringing nets and trying in vain to fix vessels that would most likely soon lie at the bottom of the sea. Scott was feeling a little unsure himself. "This is the place he told me," he said confidently. "Look for one called the Caribbean Maiden," he told them. "I don't think any of these ships are maidens," Andrew said snidely, catching an elbow from Brittany. Guys, I think that's it, Ashley said, cutting them off before they could continue to hurl insults at one another. The boat she was pointing at was not nearly as impressive as it had looked online. In fact, it looked downright old. A leftover from the 80s, more like a charter fishing boat than the party cruiser it was advertised as. Maybe Andrew had been right. They should have just stayed at the hotel. But where would the fun be in that? He reminded himself, the whole point of this trip was to get out of his comfort zone and try new things. Don't sweat it, Ashley told him. As long as there's beer there, then it's a party boat, right? Damn straight, Billy told her and started walking towards the boat, still clutching his bottles tightly. Scott and the others quickly fell behind them. Ashley was right, any place where they could drink and be together. That was the party. When they got up close, he noticed the name of the boat. The Caribbean Maiden. At least he was positive that it was the right boat. Hello, Andrew called out. Suddenly, a portly Bahamian man in his 40s, also wearing a puka shell necklace and sandals, jumped down off the boat. They hadn't even noticed him as they walked towards the boat. Luckily, he was all smiles as he greeted them. Welcome to your home, away from home, my friends, he told them as he ushered them on board. Are you Scott? He asked, looking between the three boys. I'm Scott, Scott said, walking forward, knowing that his cowlick and lack of facial hair made him look like the youngest person there. Just call me Tommy, the man said, pointing at himself. Just think of me as your new best pal, Tommy Bahamas. Like the clothing brand? Asked Andrew incredulously. Tommy laughed. You got it, kid, the coolest clothes around. Billy and the others shrugged. Scott practically jumped over the side as soon as Tommy ushered them aboard. He'd been looking forward to this trip for far too long to have it waylaid by a sketchy captain. He decided not to worry about it. Why should he? Having Tommy Bahamas as their captain will just make for an even better story when they got back to campus for graduation, he told himself. They climbed aboard, and before they even stowed their luggage down below, they were off to what Tommy told them was assuredly the best party island in all the Caribbean. Stretching out near the others, Scott soon felt himself nodding off, tired from the flight and still a little jet-lagged and more than a little buzzed. A half-empty Corona sat in the cup holder next to him. He could only smile as he watched the condensation run down the side. They had finally done it. They had arrived. Water splashed off the sides of the boat. Tommy Bahamas took them near some of the fishing boats on the way out of the marina. The girls and even Andrew found themselves oohing and ahing at the jumping dolphins, who were hungrily searching out cast-off shrimp and disoriented fish that fell from the sides of the fishing trawler in their struggle to escape. It's beautiful, yes? Tommy asked them, yelling over the sounds of the engine. What? Billy screamed in reply. All of them struggling to hear over the sounds of the boat and sea. The ocean she always provides. Tommy spouted back, laughing and holding his belly with mirth as he did so. Billy looked confused, but hid it well as he tucked into his what had to be his sixth beer. As usual, he was more concerned with getting shit-faced than taking in the sights, his loss. Scott thought. Even on the boat, it was hot. Scott didn't understand how anyone could stand fishing out here, or do anything during the day. He thought about going to take a nap down below, but it was even worse down there. Even though there were a couple of rooms down there. One of them was locked, and the other two. Well, he wasn't brave enough to sleep in any of them. As long as the beer stayed cold, though, he decided he wasn't going to complain. The heat may hurt now, but they'd get used to it, and with heat like this, it was only a matter of time before everyone started shedding their clothes. So, as far as he was concerned, the party had just begun. 2. When Scott woke up, he realized two things right off the back, the first being that he was already sunburnt. He had applied a thick amount of 70 SPF sunblock in the hotel room, but it had done nothing against the Caribbean sun. He might as well have covered himself with melted butter. His skin was red and painful to the touch. From what he could see, he looked like an overcooked lobster. Just rolling over to stand, his whole body screamed out in pain. Like someone was dragging fine grit sandpaper all over him. Then he noticed the dull throbbing in his head, which was no one's fault but his own, an after effect of not pacing himself like he should have. Why he thought that shots at noon were a good idea was beyond him. It was still the first day, and he was already over partying. Maybe they should have just stayed in the hotel, their first day after all. But it was too late for that now. They were on a party island, and he was going to have fun if it killed him. Well, scratch that, he thought, but I will go get so drunk that I can no longer feel my sunburn. It was then that he realized he was alone on the boat. All his friends were somewhere on the island, and looking around for the cooler, he saw that neither was the beer. Leaving him passed out in the sun was one thing, but taking the beer was just one step too far. He'd have to get them back before they left. Though looking down, someone had been nice enough to prop his head up with a folded towel, so maybe they weren't all bad. He didn't care if it was just wishful thinking, but he hoped it was Ashley. That would at least mean she was thinking of him. Holding the side to stabilize himself, he walked to the back of the boat and climbed down the ladder into the waist-deep ocean water. Enjoying how cool it was, if he wasn't so thirsty he'd have stayed there and let it continue to soothe his burning skin. But he could hear laughter and the sounds of partying up on the beach. Even from the water, Scott could see the lights and people dancing and having fun around an enormous bonfire. So with a sigh, he walked slowly up out of the water and onto the shore. Once up there, he pulled out his phone to take the first of what he was sure would be many beach partying selfies. He swore loudly as it made a sad whine. The battery was almost dead, plus it didn't have any signal. So much for posting a quick vacation selfie. He shrugged and winced in pain as it stretched the skin on the back of his neck. From the beach, he was amazed at how many other boats were. For such a small island, it sure was popular. Sketch Tony had come through. There were larger yachts and charter boats moored all around them. Little dinghies pulled up into the sand, for those that couldn't get too close for fear of running aground. Walking past the boats, he noticed more than a few giggles and faint music in some of them. In others, they were completely rocking. He laughed and kept going, doing his best to give them privacy. The thumping of an electronic bass echoed out over the island. When he crested the hill, his friends shouted with joy. All of them were cozying up next to the small bar. Drinks already piling up in front of them. The beach was packed with people dancing, and others selling stuff to the partygoers. He laughed as he saw a bald guy old enough to be his dad buy mushrooms off a sketchy-looking European hippie with long blonde dreads. If this wasn't spring break done right, then he didn't know what was. His sunburn was all but forgotten, as he looked around and sat down next to Ashley. "Took you long enough." She beamed at him. Her face was red too, but unlike Scott, it wasn't from the sun. He smiled back, realizing that the guys were already out of beer from the boat. "Thanks for the pillow," he told her. She laughed. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "Because," he said, pointing at Andrew and Billy, who were talking to girls at the other end of the bar. "There's no way those assholes did it." She laughed true. "Where's Brittany?" he asked, looking around and not seeing her. Ashley smiled and shook her head, then leaned back and pointed down. In confusion, Scott looked. Passed out under the bar at Ashley's feet was Brittany, a half-empty cocktail still in her hand. "Wow." That was all he could think to say. "Yeah, you're not the only one who overdid it today," she said, clapping him on the back. Scott tried not to wince because he really liked it when she touched him. "There's always tomorrow," he told her. "I'll drink to that," Ashley told him. "Come on, you've got to try this." Before he could answer, she waved down the bartender. He took the time to take it all in while she was ordering. The beach was beautiful. All white and sandy, like something out of one of those travel magazines. A small stage was set up where a guy with a laptop played through what sounded like an iPod playlist. Lasers and strobe lights lighting up the beach, all hooked to generators. Even the small bar setup had a little neon sign attached to a pole that said, "Beer's here." It was both the weirdest and coolest place he'd ever seen, all set up on an island in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, Tommy Bahamas came out of nowhere and put his arm around his shoulder. The man smelled like a weird mix of beau and tequila. He smiled at him through stained, crooked teeth. "What did I tell you? Best party all around," he shouted enthusiastically, clapping Scott on the back. Probably thinking about the big tip he was going to get. Scott thought, but instead of saying anything, he simply smiled and nodded until Tommy walked off to introduce himself to a couple of rich-looking bohemian women passing a joint back and forth. "Welcome to paradise," he thought, smiling and happy to be sitting next to Ashley, who enthusiastically handed him the most colorful drink that he'd ever seen. He cringed. It smelled like rum mixed with more rum. One look at the girl beside him was all he needed to steel himself and drink. Time to really get the party started, he thought, and tipped it back. 3. It was well into the night before any of them even considered slowing down, all of them surrounded by empty glasses, cans, and small toothpick umbrellas. The beach was filled with writhing bodies and glow sticks. Strobe lights pounded the night sky, reflecting strangely off the ocean. Scott felt like he was going to fall off the bar stool as gravity caught up with him. Andrew was already face down on the bar. At some point Ashley had collected Brittany off the ground, and together they'd gone back to the boat. He loosely remembered doing a couple shots of rum with Andrew before his friend had passed out, but he couldn't remember how long ago that was. He also kind of remembered smoking weed with Tommy, who'd then gone off with those two older women. For what the other man had claimed was bound to be some good loving. Scott would take his word for it. His head was spinning too much to even really think straight, much less laugh at Tommy's weird jokes. They'd lost sight of Billy hours ago when Scott finally saw him. He was surprised. Billy somehow had found himself a friend. A Brazilian party girl who was more than okay with him putting his tongue down her throat. Scott sighed. He was going to be pissed when they went to pull him away. But there was no way he was going to stay out here and sleep on the beach so Billy could get laid. The hangover that was coming needed to be battled from the safety of his hotel room bed, where he could keep the curtains shut and a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. Scott was already burned enough as it was, and waking up in the sand with the sun beaming down on him while he was hungover wasn't something that appealed to him even a little at this point in his life. After all, he was trying to have fun on this vacation, not kill himself. Tommy appeared as if he'd been summoned, wandering out from a grove of bushes from the center part of the island and fixing his pants. A goofy smile plastered across his face. Scott had to look around. Where did that guy come from? He wondered foggily. It felt like he'd just stepped out of the shadows. But then again, it might just be him. Since every time he moved his head even slightly, the entire world seemed to swim. Damn, he needed to sleep this thing off ASAP. He thought with a very dangerous burp, which threatened to turn into something more. "You guys ready to go?" he asked Scott, while he finished zipping up his pants with a mischievous wink. "Your buddy can't handle his drink so good, huh?" Tommy commented, laughing. As if in reply, Andrew slid off the stool and plopped straight into the sand. He groaned as he rolled around. "What time is it?" Andrew asked weakly, sprawled out like a starfish and looking up at them in a daze. "Time for us to leave, I think," Tommy told him, shaking his head and muttering something under his breath before laughing to himself. Scott slowly got down off the bar stool and onto unsteady legs. After another very worrisome burp, he helped Andrew to his feet. "I got him," Tommy told him, letting Andrew lean on him as he guided him back to the boat. Scott watched them walk off, unsure how Tommy was so steady on his feet. He was a party boat captain. He must drink like this every night. Hopefully, there wasn't anything he could hit in the ocean, he thought wryly as he walked off to grab Billy. The sand felt like it was swaying under his feet with every step. He felt for a moment like he was back on the boat, rocking with the waves. "Billy, time to go," he told him as he walked over to where Billy and the woman were rolling around in the sand together. Their make-out session quickly turning into something else. Scott felt bad for cock-blocking his friend, but they couldn't stay here and they couldn't leave Billy out here. No matter how much he might want them to at the moment. For all his bluster, Billy was a big man-child and there was no way that he could fend for himself. The woman was wrapped around Billy so tight. She looked like she was trying to absorb him. Billy looked like he was eating her face. Neither of them seemed like they wanted to come up for air. Scott could see why, even in the dull glow of the dying fire and party lights, that she was beautiful. And under normal circumstances, way out of Billy's league. Which meant that they'd be hearing about this from him for years to come. Finally, he was able to get their attention. "Bro, I'll catch up," Billy told him, laughing clearly high. His pupils were the size of saucers. Scott shook his head and then regretted it after he almost threw up. "There's no way in hell I'm going to leave you on an island. You're an asshole, but you're still my friend." "Then shove off for a little while." Billy smiled. "Give me like 15 minutes. He said, pulling the woman closer as if that was possible. She threw her head back and laughed lustily, her dark hair flying. "No way, man, we've got to go," Scott told him, getting impatient and not liking the way his stomach was feeling. He really hoped that the girls were passed out, because he had a feeling he was going to be puking over the side of the boat the whole way back. "No," the woman told him, reaching her hand out and stroking Billy's face. "You can't leave. If you do, you'll all die." "Come again?" Scott asked, not amused by their antics. That was the problem with drugs. If you weren't on them, then they weren't fun to be around. It was Billy who replied. "That's right, man. Rosita here has the sight, some Santeria shit. She says if we leave this island tonight we'll die," he said with faux seriousness. "Just another reason we should stay here, man." "Aha," Scott replied. "And she knows that how?" "There's a full moon," she said, leaning back and laughing, pointing at the shining moon, which glared out over the waves, causing them to glitter as they came towards the shore. "Right, all right, we've had our fun," Scott told them, getting irritated. "Let's go, Billy. Tommy's waiting for us." Billy seemed like he was about to say something else. Some part of him seemed to realize that getting laid was far less important than getting off this island. After all, they weren't in America anymore, and it wasn't like he could Uber his way back to the Bahamas. Or even find his way to the hotel, for that matter. Yeah, all right," Billy said and moved the girl off of him and back into the sand. "Sorry, babe, but I don't want to miss my ride," he told her. She crossed her arms and pouted. A strange expression on such an alluring face. "You can't, Billy," she pleaded as they walked away. "If you leave, you'll die," she screamed at them as they headed back to the boat. Scott shook his head as they walked around the beach. "Dude, you really need to watch who you hook up with. That girl sounded like a psycho." Billy just laughed. "That's the difference between you and me, bud. I love me the crazy ones," he told him, clapping him on the back. Together they found the boat, though it took them a moment. Tommy already had it running, and in no time they were back on board. The girls were passed out on the benches, and Andrew had claimed a chair. Billy muddled over and sat on the other bench with him. Already, Scott was feeling sick from the rocking of the boat, and knew that it wouldn't be long before he'd have to put his head over the side. It was a good time, yes. Tommy kept repeating to no one in particular, and took off. It took everything in Scott not to hurl as they bounced through the ocean. After what to his stomach felt like forever, the boat slowed near a smaller, darker island. Its only light was coming from the full moon overhead. Tommy brought the boat in closer, and then let it idle. "What's going on?" Billy demanded loudly, his voice shouting, struggling to be heard over the engines. The others perked up and looked around as well. Most of them waking up only because he was yelling. "We have arrived at your destination," Tommy told them with a sad smile. "What the fuck are you talking about?" Billy demanded, still perched over the side of the boat, dry heaving slightly and regretting all the shots he had, not to mention the pills that Sheik had given him. "This is where you get off the boat," Tommy told them, turning on a spotlight. They could now all see the small island out in the background, just a patch of rock and sand covered with what looked like a lush jungle behind it. The boat was close, but it was still a swim none of them wanted to make. Andrew and Brittany had laughed weakly, thinking that it was some sort of game, but the look on Tommy's face made it clear that he meant business. "Now leave your wallets and bags here, and get the fuck off my boat," Tommy demanded. "It's nothing personal, but a deal's a deal. You understand?" he told them, making shooing gestures for them to get off. "And if we say no?" Billy asked, trying to square up on him in one of his college wrestling positions. Though he had yet to fully gain his sea legs, and was still more than a little fucked up. Out of nowhere, at least that's what it looked like to them, Tommy produced a gun and pointed at them. "Either way, you leave," Tommy told them. "Like I said, a deal's a deal." Andrew and the others were giving Tommy their full attention now. Slowly they rose to their feet, albeit a little unsteadily, and emptied their pockets. "Jewelry too?" Tommy demanded, eyeing the tennis bracelet on Brittany's wrist. The guys were lined up all about to jump overboard when Billy rushed him. They struggled for the gun. Then knocked against the console, the engines throttled and the boat launched full speed ahead, throwing the others off their feet. Ashley grabbed out towards Scott as she was thrown overboard. Still on unsteady feet, she and Scott both disappeared over the side of the boat, followed by a large splash. The boat was already too far away to do them any good. A flash and a bang pierced the night. The loud crack of the pistol echoed out over the water. Billy stopped struggling and held his side, and with a grunt he fell overboard backwards into the wake of the charging boat. Brittany made a choked sob, and Andrew didn't know what to say. Tommy turned around and pointed the gun at them. "Now you, my friend." He gestured to Andrew. Andrew's eyes got big, and he tackled Brittany off of the side of the boat. He figured it would be better for both of them to brave the water than to stay and face Tommy with a gun and what was coming. He'd seen something that Tommy hadn't. Tommy was laughing as he turned back to the console. He screamed when he saw what Andrew had seen. He made a dash towards the console, but it was too late and the sandbar in front of the island was too close. Before he could even scream, his boat bottomed out, launching him out onto the island shore like a rag doll. 4. Billy was in the water. He didn't even remember falling overboard. Last thing he remembered was wrestling Tommy for the gun, and then bang, the gun went off and he was overboard. He'd been shot. He realized that, if it was only dimly. "Holy shit, Tommy shot me. Like for real shot me." Billy couldn't believe this was actually happening, as he struggled to stay above water. The pain in his side was jarring, and the sting of the salt water in his wound wasn't helping. Each breath he took only brought another sharp pain to his side. Billy started to panic and thrash around in the water wildly, looking for someone or something that could save him. But there wasn't anyone or anything around. The boat was gone, and without the spotlight, all he could see was the ominous dark island barely silhouetted by the light of the moon. He was on his own, and if he was going to survive, he needed to figure something out now. Billy stopped thrashing so loudly and tried to steady his breathing just like he used to do when he played sports. Then he did his best to listen, hoping he'd hear shouting or splashing. Instead he found he couldn't hear anything but the ocean. His breath started to come faster and faster. "Stop panicking," he told himself. It was too deep out here. If he didn't get a hold of himself, he'd drown. Years of swim team came back to him, and slowly he got his breathing under control. Maybe it was the booze or the weed helping to numb some of the pain, but somehow he could put one arm in front of the other and head towards the shore. The more he concentrated on that one goal, the more he was able to stop thinking about the pain in his side. First, he had to get to the island. Everything else could be figured out later. Still swimming towards the island, he took a minute to tread water and catch his breath. He didn't want to push himself too hard. If he did that, then he would tire out too fast. Worst case scenario, his muscles would lock up and he'd drown. This is a marathon. He reminded himself it wasn't a sprint. Taking a deep breath, he slipped his left hand down over the wound, using his right hand and legs to stay afloat. Luckily for him, it was a rather calm night. So he was able to pull himself along slowly towards the island with only his right hand, not having to fight too hard against the tide. The wound, though, was not just in his side, it was also in his back where the bullet had exited. That was a good thing, Billy tried to tell himself through and through. That was good, right? At least that's what they always said in the movies. Through and through. Thinking about it again made him feel better. Plus, when he got home, he'd have a bitching scar to show off. Women like scars, right? That's what he always heard, plus he was pretty much a hero at this point. Shot by a bad guy and survived to tell about it, that was a good story. He'd be the coolest person at any party he went to. That made him feel a little better. Instead of a scared 22-year-old, it made him feel more like an action hero. Especially since he'd wrestled for a gun with a bad dude in a tropical location, all to protect some beautiful women. He smiled despite himself. Hell, he was practically Van Damme. They'd be making movies about him in no time. He could see it now. Hollywood types would line up as soon as he stepped back in the States, and his story got out. He'd never have to buy drinks for himself again, that's for damn sure. Going along, he felt like the island was slowly getting closer. Though he still tried his best to remember the saint who healed wounds. Simon? No, that wasn't it. He'd never been a good Catholic to begin with, or even half as religious as his mother for that matter. College and hard partying had only pulled him farther from his parents' faith. But tonight, he prayed for divine intervention. What was it they always said? There's no such things as an atheist in a foxhole. His cousin had told him that after his first tour in Afghanistan, Billy hadn't understood what it really meant until now. This might not be a foxhole by his cousin's standards, but alone and bleeding in the ocean definitely felt just as dangerous to him. The more he dragged himself through the water, the more tired he was getting. He wished he wasn't so sober right now. The alcohol's effects had left him about 20 strokes ago. For him, that made it so much worse, knowing how much pain he was in and just how far away he still was. It looked like his luck was changing, though, as he felt the current pulling him towards the island. The tide, it seemed, was going in, and the closer he got to the island, the more the current pulled him towards it. He sighed in relief as he struggled to catch his breath. Everything might work out after all. He offered a silent prayer of thanks to whoever was listening. Billy was breathing too heavily to do anything verbally other than pant and cough. Out of nowhere, he felt something nudge his side. Whatever it was almost gentle. As though it was testing it to see if he was sturdy. Whatever bumped into him had slick skin and moved past him fast. He had a sudden cold, sinking feeling. Shark. That was the first word that came into his mind. Especially since he was bleeding in the middle of the ocean. How far could they smell blood in the water? 1 mile, 100. His heart started pounding. Shit. For a moment he forgot to kick and sank down. He needed to get out of the water right now. The island wasn't that far away, he thought, trying his best to stay positive. If he panicked and began thrashing, then the shark would come back thinking he was wounded. He'd watched enough TV to know that. It could be anything, he reminded himself. After all, there were probably tons of fish around the shore. Last thing he needed to do was freak himself out anymore. He didn't have enough energy left to panic anyhow. Putting his arm forward again, he swam, doing his best to push the thoughts of sharks out of his mind. He needed to not think like that. There was a bunch of different kind fish. He just really wished he could remember some of them right now. Because that way he could get his mind off of sharks. Anything but sharks. Suddenly, there was another nudge. This one was harder, and caused him to sputter as water went into his mouth. As he bobbed down in the water, he could barely make out what did it. One look, however, was more than enough. I'm fucked, Billy thought, as he saw the shark swim away. It wasn't big, not like the movies. It was nothing more than a 3-foot-long reef shark. He'd actually fished them a couple of times with his dad, back in the day down in Florida. But wounded and alone, it was more than a match for him. Looking around, he saw more dorsal fins break through the water. It wasn't alone. Now those fins were circling him. A pissing contest to see which one of them would get the first bite. He swam, pushing himself towards the island, knowing that it was too far away. When the first bite came, he barely felt it. Just another solid nudge and something swimming by. The only difference was there was a chunk missing out of his left arm. That was when Billy started to cry and pray at the same time. "Please make them go away," he shouted to the night sky, not caring how much ocean water went in his mouth and nose as he did so. The only answer was the crash of waves on the distant shore. A fin charged him, and he could only watch in horror as a mouthful of teeth rose out of the water coming at his chest level. Billy instinctively rose his right hand to block it. He watched as his hand went into the shark's mouth. It wasn't even warm, just cold and clammy. The shark bit down and jerked around. Billy screamed loudly. It felt like his hand was caught in a saw. He jerked and pulled back, then screamed again as he was greeted by the sight of a bloody stump where his hand used to be. Billy was blacking out when the other sharks came towards. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him had to be an illusion brought on from blood loss. It was a bunch of people with painted faces, beating the waters with oars and spears. But they looked nothing like the saints he'd learned about in Sunday school class. 5. Scott knew they were in trouble the minute he surfaced from the water. He could see clear enough across the water to know that they were still far from the shore. Lucky for them, it felt like the tide was pulling them towards the island instead of away from it, which would hopefully help make the swim a little easier. The first thing he did was swim over to the thrashing form of Ashley, who had never been a strong swimmer for as long as he'd known her. Scott, however, had been a lifeguard throughout high school and during the summer of his freshman year of college. He quickly swam behind Ashley, wrapped his right arm around her and pulled her up above the water. She thrashed wildly in his grip, fighting both him and the water. "Stop panicking," he told her quietly as she struggled to catch her breath. Her mind was still reeling from what had just happened. Ashley, who had come from a very calm, classy and well-groomed middle-class background, had never been in an emergency and probably did not know how she was supposed to react. Why shouldn't she panic? Things like this weren't supposed to happen to her. They weren't supposed to happen to him either, not really. But Scott thought this was something straight out of a late-night crime film, but he'd always been quick to roll with the punches. After a minute of treading water, Ashley caught her breath around the same time that Scott realized his hands being wrapped around her body. He coughed and immediately let go of her, putting enough space between them to make it less awkward, but still close enough that he could grab her if she went down. He looked over at the island, watching the thin trail of smoke silhouetted by the moon drift up into the clouds. That must be where the boat ran up on the shore. Apparently, the sandbar had acted as a ramp to launch it up on the shore. Good, he thought, trying to stay optimistic. It gave them something to aim for. Of course, getting to the island was the priority, but if they could get back to the boat, then maybe they'd actually have a chance of surviving out here until help arrived. Even a psycho like Tommy would have some sort of emergency supplies aboard. If nothing else, at least he would have fresh water, something they'd direly need when the sun came up. The island was still too far away, and the current, while it was pulling them towards the island, it was pulling them to other side. They'd be fighting against it to get to the boat. He knew they could if they swam in sprints. They shouldn't have too much of a problem. They'd just have to push themselves. "All right," he said, "now let's try to head for the island," he said, sputtering a little water at the last part. Knowing that each minute they wasted the ocean would pull them farther and farther away from their goal, he'd already started to head towards the shore, doing his best to keep the smoke in his line of sight with every stroke that he took. Ashley followed behind him just somewhat slower, but she'd quickly copied the way he was swimming and was slowly getting closer. "We'll never make it, it's too far," she said, exasperated, already slowing down. He couldn't blame her, he felt it too. Even with the adrenaline pumping through his body, he still felt the drain from all the partying they'd done earlier in the night. "Yes, we will," he shot back, trying his best not to lose hope. "We just have to take it slow so that we won't tire out too quickly. And I'll be here for you every minute of the way," he said, with what he hoped was a reassuring smile, and then remembered that even with the light from the moon she probably couldn't see it. They swam again, taking their time. Stroke after steady stroke, and Scott was happy that even though Ashley was breathing hard, they were making some headway. Worst case scenario, he'd have to pull her along. Though the way his own body was aching, he wasn't sure if he'd be able to do that all the way to the shore. If it came to it, he'd do the best that he could. There was no way that Scott was going to leave her beyond, even if it meant endangering his own life. If his estimates were right, they were about a mile, maybe a mile and a half out. Not as bad as it could have been. For once he was happy that his parents had forced him to take all of those swimming classes, and that lifeguarding had paid so well. Scott's arm splashed down, and he suddenly realized that he hadn't heard the same one from Ashley. Which meant that she wasn't swimming. "Shit. Are you okay?" he asked, doing his best to tread water without being pulled deeper out. He turned around and saw Ashley thankfully still treading water steadily. Her hand was stretched out and she was pointing at something. He followed it just as she swam away from whatever had caught her attention. A fin had cut through the water, swimming almost lazily. Not quite towards them, but definitely enough in their direction that it was clear whatever it was knew they were there. Scott swore, and a deep feeling of dread came over him. Whatever that fin belonged to, he knew one thing for sure: it wasn't a fucking dolphin. And in water this deep, they might as well be sitting ducks. No, worse than that, because ducks can fly away. Sharks were an apex predator, and he wasn't naive enough to think that the two of them could outswim a shark. If it attacked them, the best they could hope for is for one of them to get away while the sharks were preoccupied with the other. Andrew and him used to love to sit on the couch in their frat house, smoke weed, and watch Shark Week, and if he'd learned anything from that, it was that if you see one shark, then there were a ton more all around you that you couldn't see. "Just stay still," he called out to her. "Stay still," he shouted again. "Splashing wildly will attract them. It makes them think you're wounded." "Thanks for the lesson. I'll keep that in mind. Any tidbits on how to make it go away?" She was on the verge of panicking, and he knew it. They'd been friends for years now, and he knew that edge in her voice. Scott had seen enough specials on TV to know that if she started thrashing, then that shark was going to start circling, which meant it would then attack. For the first time, he wondered what had happened to Billy. Just maybe, there was another reason they hadn't seen him swimming. How could he have answered their shouts if he were in a shark's stomach? Is this why Tommy brought them here, to feed them to sharks? Billy had been shot and then fell overboard. For Billy's sake, he really hoped that he'd been dead when he hit the water. Being eaten alive seemed like a terrible way to go, and one that, as he watched the shark dart back and forth, truly hoped wouldn't happen to him. Ashley let a small panicked sob as the shark came closer. It then proceeded to circle her once, only to shoot off in the other direction, its fin disappearing from view. Scott was happy that it was dark enough to the point that he couldn't see it clearly. Though part of him thought it was even worse not knowing where it was at. Especially since, in all probability, it was probably now swimming under them. Just like all the others. He let out a breath. He hadn't even known he'd been holding. They needed to get out of the water now. Ashley began to swim towards him again. She made it back over to him, taking her time not to draw attention to herself. She just wished this was all over. They were both over the Bahamas. If they made it out of this, Scott was never going to the beach again. This time she swam so close to him that every now and again, they bumped into each other. He didn't blame her though, not for a minute. In fact, if she hadn't moved closer, then Scott would have moved closer to her. There was safety in numbers. At least he really hoped that was true. Maybe they'd at least look like a bigger animal, while swimming so close together. He hoped that would be enough to make a shark stop and give attacking them a second thought. though he really doubted it, not if it was hungry enough. Before long, there was mud under their feet, but they didn't stop swimming until they pulled themselves up onto the dry sand. He didn't even mind the way the sand and shells cut and dragged against his stomach. In fact, he relished it. Scott lay there gasping for breath, and Ashley lay beside him, letting out choked, ragged sobs. Scott wanted to cry too, but he knew she needed him to be strong right now. So did the rest of his friends, wherever they were. If they're even still alive, that is. Scott felt guilty just thinking about it. But he knew that it was true. In all likelihood, they were either dead or really fucked up from the boat crash. "Where are the others?" she asked, rolling over on her side. Her eyes were puffy from tears and the salt water, though she still looked stunning. He fought the urge to comfort her. As Andrew was fond of saying, this was definitely not the time. Scott propped himself up on his shoulders. I don't know," he whispered, looking out at the eerily silent sea stretched out before him, mostly to avoid her gaze. It devastated him to see her scared and not be able to do anything about it. The only sound were the waves crashing onto the shore. What if they were it? What if their friends are dead? Hell, there's no guarantee they even made it to shore. For all he knew, Andrew and Brittany could be really messed up from the boat crash, or they could have hit the water and panicked. Or Tommy could have shot them. In the water, with everything else going on, they might not have heard it. He didn't want to tell her that though. Ashley was smart, way smarter than him. He had no doubt she was thinking the same thing, and like him, just didn't want to be the one to say it. "Earth to Scott," Ashley said, grabbing his hand, her voice calmer than it had been a moment before. He practically jumped. "Sorry?" He apologized, knowing that he'd done it again. Way to zone out in an emergency. He silently cursed himself. He needed to keep his head in the game if they were going to make it through this. She nodded. "You looked lost there for a moment, and I need you to stay here, you know? I know this is a lot right now, but if we work together, we'll be fine." He tried to smile and failed. Ashley the optimist never thought I'd see the day. "Me neither," she muttered. "Good news is I can see the smoke from the boat. Bad news is, it looks like it's going to be a bit of a walk. We didn't get as close to the boat as we hoped," she told him, pointing. He sighed and fell down into the sand. His legs already felt like jelly as it was. Without them realizing it at the time, the current must have pulled them further down the beach. Not that he'd been paying attention when swimming as fast as he could away from the sharks. Slowly, they both stood and walked down the beach where they'd swam ashore, neither one of them sure if going to the boat was the right idea. What if they wasted all that energy, and it was on fire or something? All those supplied would be lost and they'd be screwed. He thought, then he smiled and waved. 3 figures were making their way down the beach towards them. "Guys," Ashley shouted. "We're over here," she said, waving her arms towards them, jumping up and down to draw more attention to them. Scott smiled, feeling a lot better now that everyone was about to be back together. He knew in his heart that if the 5 of them all worked together, they'd be able to get out of this. He was sure of it. "Why aren't they answering?" Ashley asked as she stopped waving. Scott shrugged. "Maybe they're tired. They might have had a harder swim. Plus they walked, you know. Or Tommy's still out there with a gun," she told him quietly. "Shit," Scott replied. "I hadn't thought about that." "Scott, wait," Ashley shouted at him as he took off down the beach towards the figures. Not worried at the moment about her concerns. If Ashley was right about Tommy, then it would be better if he moved towards them. That way, they'd all be on the same page a lot sooner. It was hard to see them in the dimming moonlight, but when he could finally make them out a little more, he pulled up short. Had Andrew gotten taller? He wondered, as he pulled up short in front of the first figure. "Hey guys." No sooner were the words out of his mouth, he realized his mistake. Before he could shout out a warning to Ashley, the figure snarled and his fist lashed out, hitting Scott so hard in the head he was seeing stars, The last thing he saw before he passed out was more figures with what he imagined to be the same painted faces run out of the forest and grab Ashley. Not like she had anywhere else to go. 6. Andrew and Brittany had jumped off the boat just in time, right before it had hit the shore. The last thing they heard before they hit the water was Tommy's scream as the boat jumped onto the sandbar and slammed into the shore. After that, they couldn't hear anything. It was like the sound of the sea drowned everything else out. When she came up for air, the first thing she saw was the trail the boat had cut into the sand before coming to its last resting place halfway between the ocean and the trees lining the shore. Luckily, they were in a relatively shallow area of the water and could stand. Though the water still came up past their hips, which to her meant that anything could swim around them without them seeing it. Looking at the shore, she could see the boat and the smoke coming from the engine. "That's not good," Andrew said, bobbing up beside her. He came closer, doing a bit of a jumping skip as he struggled to walk across the bottom. "No shit," she shot back. "It wasn't like we were going to push it back into the water anyway," she added in a somewhat softer tone, knowing that now wasn't the time to snap at one another. Slowly, they made it to the beach. It took longer than either of them would have liked, but they preferred walking to swimming at this point. And they both had their eyes peeled for anything that might be swimming in the water with them. To Andrew's relief, they made it to shore without bumping into anything predatory. Brittany was more than happy to be out of the water herself. Being stranded at sea was one of her biggest fears. Other than partying on the beach, Brittany wasn't a huge fan of deep bodies of water. If they'd been thrown further out, she was pretty sure she'd have drowned from a panic attack before ever making to shore. Andrew stood there on the beach, catching his breath while she looked around. All she could see were the waves crashing on the beach. Beyond them was an unending expanse of dark water. If there was anyone in the water, they certainly wouldn't be able to see them from here. "Where are the others?" Brittany asked aloud, almost sobbing before getting a hold of herself. Andrew simply shook his head, still gathering himself. It seemed like a lifetime ago, but in reality, it was only a couple of hours before they were getting drunk on the beach. Now this happened, and they were both struggling not to lose their shit. They needed to stay calm if they were going to get through this. "I don't know," he finally said, doing his best to keep the swirl of emotions he felt out of his voice. Another struggle. Looking around, he couldn't see anyone either. They were completely alone out here. Part of him had hoped that maybe the others were already at the beach, but that was impossible. They'd all fallen out or jumped off into the deeper waters. And depending on how strong the current was out there, well, there was a good possibility that they were already gone. Not that he was going to be the one to say that, not out loud anyway. "We should search the boat, try to get some supplies. There's probably a flare gun or something in there," he said, changing the subject and headed over to where the boat was beached further up the shore. After one last look out at the water, Brittany followed him. The front of the boat was dug pretty deeply into the beach, the windshields in the front were shattered, and cracks ran along the sides. Even if by some miracle they were able to get it back out into the water, they would sink before they got anywhere. Carefully, Andrew climbed aboard, not wanted to get splinters or cut his bare feet on the broken edges of the boat. The engine was still smoking, but the trail of it had thinned since it had finally turned off. Sparks still shot from the dash panels though, but he knew as soon as the battery died that would no longer be any cause for concern. "Any sign of Tommy?" Brittany called up to him, while he rummaged around in all the cabinets and under the dashes looking for anything that could help them. "No," he called down to her, trying not to shout just in case Tommy was skulking about. But he doubted that. Judging from the busted glass, Andrew was willing to bet money that Tommy had been thrown from the boat and in all likelihood was dead or dying. And even if he wasn't, no one could walk away from an accident like this unscathed. So if he was still out there, he certainly wasn't in any shape to come after them. He swore as he looked through coolers which still had a few beers in them, and the rest of the boat which seemed to be completely empty of fresh water or food. They were in trouble, while Andrew hadn't followed it to Eagle Scout like his mom had wanted. He had spent much of middle and high school camping with his buddy's troop, more than enough time to educate him what to do in this situation. Step 1: find water. And of course there was none. They could drink the beer if it got bad, but it would probably only dehydrate them quicker. How many waters had they drunkenly poured on themselves because they were hot on the way out? Shit. Looking around, he swore again that idiot Tommy hadn't even stocked his own boat correctly. Why would he? He realized. After all, he only hopped islands that were less than a couple of hours apart from each other. It wasn't like Tommy was crossing the entire ocean. And he was sleazy, so he probably would not spend the money if he didn't have to. Digging under the captain's chair and console brought another muttered curse. Tommy didn't even have a flare gun, or anything could signal for help with. You find anything? Brittany called again, sounding concerned. He didn't want to freak her out, but he had to tell her about the water situation. Andrew came to the back of the boat and climbed back down, carrying the only things he'd found to be of any use. Some old beach towels that they'd brought from the hotel, and a rusty fishing knife he'd found downstairs by a sink that he doubted Tommy had ever cleaned. One that, to his disappointment, didn't even work. The fishing knife was of course more rust than a knife at this point, but it had enough of an edge that they could still use it. Especially since it looked like they were going to be here for a while. Damn it, if only that murderous idiot had a flare gun, then at least they'd have a real chance of getting off this island. Now they'd have to find some way to make a signal fire, and pray that someone sees it that knows what they're looking at. He looked around and sighed. There wouldn't be anything they could do about it tonight. Did you find anything? She asked him again. Nothing that will really help us. He told her solemnly. There wasn't any water on the boat. We're going to need to go further inland to find some. He told her, doing his best to sound more confident than he felt. Because he very much doubted they'd find water anywhere on this island, they could always drink coconut milk if it came to it. He remembered that much from all those survival shows he watched. He looked over at Brittany as he walked up on the beach. It was clear that she was still coming to grips with their new reality. They were screwed, no doubts about it. The best thing they could do was find the others. Andrew didn't even want to have an honest discussion about their likelihood of being rescued at this point. He'd watched enough survival shows to know their likelihood of them actually being rescued. Even if they spelled out SOS on the beach, there was a good chance that anyone who saw it would just keep on flying, thinking it was a prank. What kind of moron didn't even have a flashlight on their boat? He wondered again and kicked the sand like a child. Though it did make him feel better, even if only for a moment. You okay? Brittany asked him instinctively, emotion riding high in her voice as though she realized how ridiculous the question was halfway through, making him feel instantly bad about his little outburst. Yeah, I'll be fine. He muttered. Come on, let's go check out the forest. We need to find fresh water as soon as possible. What about the others? She asked, turning back towards the water and looking to see if she saw anyone along the shore. She didn't. We have no way of knowing where they're going to wash up. He told her, not adding the if they both knew was going to be in there. Either way, we need water. We'll die on this island without it. He told her and started to head off. She stood there for a second, uncertain, and then ran to catch up. He was already at the point where the tree line met the beach, when he heard her cry behind him. Turning around quickly, he saw her trip over something half buried in the sand. Andrew ran over. He first thought that she just tripped over a piece of driftwood or something, until he realized that she was, in fact, wrestling with someone in the sand. Get off me, she screamed, punching and kicking wildly at whoever was grappling with her. Andrew ran up and kicked the man as hard as he could in the side, causing him to groan in pain and let go of her. He helped her back to her feet. You okay? Brittany nodded. No, thanks to this piece of shit, she said, raising her foot to kick him again. Wait. Tommy begged. Bloody and bruised, one of his gold teeth, missing along with several of his regular teeth, sprawled out on the beach. Unable to pull himself up. One of his legs looked like it was twisted all the way around. "You need to help me." "Fuck you, man!" Andrew shouted at him, rearing back to kick him again. "Andrew!" Brittany chided, startling him. He lowered his foot grudgingly. Andrew had never been a violent person, but Tommy deserved whatever he got as far as he was concerned. Tommy, seeing a savior, quickly begged Brittany for mercy. "Please," he said, "my leg is busted, you help me, I know another way off the island. But we have to go before they find us." Tommy pleaded with her, completely ignoring the look of pure hate that Andrew was giving him. Brittany and Andrew looked at each other, one look at Andrew's deep scowl, and it was obvious what his opinion on the matter was. Brittany, on the other hand, wasn't sure she could leave an injured man to die alone on an island, no matter how evil he was. She also didn't like the idea of him being out and about, without them being able to monitor him. "Tommy, what are you talking about?" Brittany asked him slowly, like she would with a child, while Andrew looked wildly around the island for anyone else who might be prowling around. Tommy made a whimpering sound in the back of his throat. A sound no grown man should make, Andrew thought. "Whatever you do, don't let them take us," he begged them again. "Andrew, we've got to help him," Brittany told him, exasperated. Andrew shook his head. "Have you forgotten that he was going to leave us for whoever they are? It's his fault that we are out here in the first place. Not to mention this fucker shot Billy." Then a little lower he added, "Besides, carrying him will only slow us down." Tommy made a little lunge at their legs, trying to stop them from walking off. "Please don't leave me." "Tommy, stop, or I swear to God I'll kick you again," Andrew ordered him. "Look, you'll be fine on the beach. We are going into the jungle to find water to help us. We can't carry you and do that, okay?" Tommy stopped struggling and nodded. "Okay, but you will come back." Andrew was about to tell him to go to hell, but one look at Brittany's face and he knew the answer. "Yes, we will come back, a couple of big sticks, and we can use the towels to make a pole behind a stretcher." Tommy nodded. Good, he said, realizing he was going to be saved. "Go, be quick, and come back before they come for us," he said, and shooed them off with a manic grin. Andrew was pretty sure the man had lost it. He grabbed Brittany's elbow and turned her around before heading for the jungle. Somewhere out on the beachfront, a conch horn sounded. "What was that?" Brittany asked. Turning, Andrew stopped her from going back, and sprinting he pulled her into the forest. Once there, he immediately got down and kept his hand around her mouth. She pulled it off and was about to cuss him out when she saw what he did. A group of people running across the beach, heading straight for the boat, and then Tommy. Tommy was yelling, no wailing was more like it. Whoever these people were, it was clear that Tommy was absolutely terrified of them. Just as they reached him, Tommy pulled something out from under him. The pistol. Andrew realized. That lying sack of shit still had it. Andrew didn't even want to think what he'd been planning to do with it later. Tommy got off 3 shots, Brittany gasped as one of the figures dropped on the beach. The others didn't even stop. They could only watch in horror as they quickly fell upon Tommy, quickly beating him down and tying him up. Andrew gulped as he watched them carry off the other man. Tommy's words echoing through his mind. "Don't let them take you." 7. When Scott woke up, his head was throbbing. The last time his head had hurt this badly was the morning after his first kegger. The only difference was this headache was accompanied by a large goose egg on his forehead. For a minute, he couldn't remember what had happened. All he could think about was the pounded ache in his head and the chill of the floor. That's when the facts started to come back to him. They were stranded on an island and somehow it had gotten worse. He moved to sit up and immediately regretted it. His head swam, and he felt sick quickly as he laid back down. Startled, he realized that where his head lay was warm. A soft hand stroked his head. Scott's vision swam for a moment, but finally everything came into focus. He realized he was laying in Ashley's lap. Which, under different circumstances, would have been like a dream come true. Except that both of them were locked in a sturdy-looking metal cage. "They hit you pretty hard," Ashley told him as she continued to stroke his hair. He remained still, afraid that she might stop if he moved. "Yeah, who are they?" he asked, lazily flicking one of his fingers against the bars. Only to be met with a decent pinging sound as his nail clinked off the thick metal, making any thoughts of escape he may have had vanish. "You'll see," she told him. "They aren't what I expected. I'm not sure what's going on here, but whatever it is, I've got a feeling it's terrible." He didn't know what to make of that. After all, he was sitting here thinking about the cannibal movies from the 70s, and was 98% sure that's what was going to happen. They were going to get eaten gallows style on some island that no one even knew existed. Well, no one but Tommy, which took their chances of a rescue from slim to none. But from the small quiver in Ashley's voice, he couldn't help but think whoever their captors were, they were much worse than Tommy could ever hope to be. Ashley was one of the strongest people he knew. If these people had her rattled, then they were royally screwed. Knowing that he couldn't lie here all day, no matter how much he wanted to, Scott slowly sat up. "Easy," Ashley told him as she helped him along. "Thanks," he told her and tried to smile, but his head was swimming and he had to lean against the bars just to stay upright. "Anytime," she replied, leaning against him. "Shit," was all he could say, taking in their surroundings. They were in a pretty decent-sized room. There weren't any windows, and based on the interlocking brown stones that made up the walls, Scott got the distinct feeling they were underground. Even worse was the fact that the room was filled with cages. Many of them were already empty. Across from them was Billy. He was in a cage as well. One of his hands was gone, nothing but a stump, one that looked like it had been gnawed on by something big. He also had a couple of chunks missing from his leg, which was also bandaged but already bleeding through. Clearly, whoever had taken them wanted them alive for now. "Billy?" Scott shouted over to him. "Shush," Ashley shushed him. "They might come back. Besides, I think he's dying. He's all pale and just sits there. We tried to get his attention, but he won't say anything. Hell, he won't even move," she whispered sadly. "We?" he asked, looking around. She nodded over to the other cage. Sitting in there, battered and bruised with an obviously broken leg, was Tommy. He nodded to them, but otherwise remained silent. Even from where they were sitting, his jaw looked bruised and swollen. Scott doubted he could say much, even if he wanted to. Looking around the room, it was clear that whoever had them was used to holding people for long periods of time. And it also knew how to keep them alive, even if it was only at a bare minimum. He really hoped that Billy and Tommy being alive was a good sign and meant they didn't mean to kill them. But he still couldn't imagine that anyone that had cages for humans didn't mean them some type of harm. "The good news is Andrew and Brittany are still alive, Ashley," she told him. "That's good," Scott replied, feeling a little better about their situation. Andrew had been a Boy Scout before college and had a lot of outdoor experience. If anyone could find a way to signal for help, it would be him. He'd feared the worst when they'd gotten to shore. But just knowing that his friends were still alive out there made him feel hopeful. If they could somehow find a way to link up, then he knew that they'd be able to get off the island. He just hoped Andrew and Brittany could avoid being found in the meantime. Now, Ashley and him just had to figure out a way to get out of here and carry Billy. Even in the state he was in, they couldn't leave him behind. Billy was an asshole, but he was their asshole. They'd known him since freshman year. No matter what his other faults were, Billy would never leave them behind if their roles were reversed. Tommy, though, was on his own as far as Scott was concerned. And after seeing Billy, he honestly doubted he'd lose a wink of sleep over leaving Tommy to his fate. "Why'd they take us?" Scott asked, scooting back to the back so he could sit propped up beside her and have a quiet conversation. She shrugged. "I don't know. Tommy just keeps rambling about how he shouldn't have let them take him alive." "That can't be a good sign," Scott replied. Then turned to Tommy. Hey asshole, he said and threw a rock off the floor at him. It bounced off his shoulder, which seemed to get the other Mont's attention. What? He asked, practically sniveling through his broken teeth. Who are these people? Scott asked. Tommy shook his head and laughed. No, not people. Devils. Devils? Ashley asked, looking at Scott. Aye. Tommy nodded fervently. Devils, they do evil things on the island. Evil magic. Right, well, if they're so evil, why did you try to leave us here? Scott asked him. Tommy looked away. My boss makes me. Every full moon, we bring them out, you know. Some drunk tourists. People go missing all the time partying in the Caribbean. And in return, these people, they pay us the tourists' weight in gold. The tourists' weight in gold? Scott asked incredulously, making sure he was hearing right. Tommy nodded. Exactly. We don't ask what happens to them, but there are stories. Dreadful stories. Tell us, Ashley prompted, leaning forward. Tommy shook his head and muttered a prayer in Spanish. No. You don't say those stories out loud, he said and crossed himself, not while you're on the island. Didn't you used to come on the island to pick up the gold? Scott asked him. No, Tommy replied. We never set foot on the island. They couldn't pay me enough for that. The devils used to bring it out to us in a boat. Make Andres very happy. Andres? He asked. Tommy smiled, giving them a full view of his shattered teeth and bloody gums. Yes, Andres, he is going to be very upset now. Once I don't check in with him, he will come looking for his boat. Then these devils will be in real trouble, Tommy said with a nasty laugh. I take it Andres is a dangerous man? Ashley asked him quietly. Tommy nodded again. A terrible man. He stopped running drugs to do this. That's what the tourist boats used to be for, but this was more lucrative and drew a lot less attention, he said with a smile. Wouldn't people come looking for the missing people? Ashley asked, almost angrily. Tommy shrugged it off. Sure they come. But people go missing all the time. Especially since they come here to party, screw and do drugs. Bad things happen, you know, he said with a shrug, as if this was just an everyday occurrence. So when he gets here, Andres will save us? Scott asked, not caring how bad Andres was if he could get them out of here. Tommy sighed and slumped back down against his cell. No, I don't think he will get here in time. But he will avenge us, he will put holes in all these devils' heads, he told them with a sad smile. Scott didn't know what to say to that. They both slid back against the cell as the door to the room suddenly opened, and two men walked in. Ashley had been right, they weren't at all what he expected. Painted from head to toe with white or blue paint. They looked like tribal ravers here for some Mad Max-themed music festival. People who on any other occasion, he'd have made fun of. Scott couldn't stop staring at them, and it wasn't just because of the paint, it was because he was 100% sure they were either American or European, or a mixture of both. He wanted to ask them, but one look at the fear on Tommy's face and he bit down on shouting or asking them anything. Whatever they did out here, it was clear these two guys were used to this, he thought as he watched them walk easily between the cages. They walked right up to Billy's cell, not even giving him or the others a second glance. He's not going to last long, one of them said. Oi, the other replied, squatting down in a heavy accent. Shark bites are pretty fucking nasty. Might as well take him first. They opened the cell, and unceremoniously grabbed Billy and drug him out of his cell. He didn't even fight, as they dragged him out. Whatever had happened to Billy out in the ocean, it was clear it had taken every ounce of fight right out of him. He didn't even look at Scott or Ashley as he was taken away. He just kept staring blankly at the wall. Trapped in his own personal nightmare. Where are you taking him? Scott demanded, standing as far as he could within the confines of the cage. The two painted men looked at each other and laughed. The one with the accent spoke up. Don't be in a rush. You'll find out soon enough, he said with a grin. And then they could only watch, still locked away as they dragged Billy out of the room. Tommy started to pray feverishly as the door banged shut. And deep down, Scott knew right then he'd never see Billy again. 8. Scott was wrong. Billy hadn't been catatonic. Far from it, he knew everything that was going on around him. The truth was, he'd just given up. After the shark attack, Billy knew that fate was against him and that fighting it was pointless. That's why he didn't fight when they dragged him out of the cell. He was too cold, too tired, too numb to give a fuck at this point. And his wounds from the bites burned, that much he could still feel as the dirt on the floor ground into them. He'd remembered hearing somewhere that sharks carried crazy amounts of bacteria in their mouths because they ate trash, carrion, and anything else that got in their way. He could only imagine the kind of infection that was breeding inside his wounds. Billy wasn't dumb. Well, not as dumb as everyone thought he was. He knew that these people had no intentions of helping him or his friends. They'd bandaged his wounds, but just enough so he wouldn't bleed out. He'd seen enough of this place and these people on the way in to know that they were batshit insane, and there was no way they were going to let any of them leave here alive. He'd listened to them talking on the boat, on the way to the island. They needed him and his friends alive, but only so they could use them as an offering. At first, he'd thought they were into some crazy sex shit. The kind they make late-night grindhouse movies about, where young people go on vacation only to disappear and reappear strung out on drugs and working in an Albanian brothel. But then he'd seen the temple. And he knew they were truly fucked. They dragged him out of the room and into a narrow hallway, lit only by torchlight. It hurt having his wounds drug across rough stone floors. Carvings decorated the walls that they passed. Billy looked but couldn't care less, not that he could really make them out anyway. He knew how all this was going to end. Indiana Jones wasn't coming to save them. One thing though was clear, whoever these people were, they weren't from here. Americans, British, other expats, definitely some sort of cult that had chosen this place for some sort of nefarious purposes. And he had a really bad feeling he was about to find out what those were, whether he liked it or not. The temple itself looked like something out of a book about the Aztecs or Mayans. It had to be thousands of years old. Yet, he'd never heard of it. Which didn't mean anything. He was a C- student at best in history, and had slept through most of his intro to anthropology classes. But still, it seemed like something like this would have been turned into a tourist attraction by now. He almost screamed in pain as they took a turn, and the guy on the left hand slipped and rubbed his bandage nub. But he refused to give them that. The guy almost apologized for his blunder, then seemed to think better of it. He just shook his head, and started once again to pull Billy along. The hallway ended in front of a pair of massive double doors. Billy felt a spike of primal when he looked at it. He'd never been very spiritual, but Billy could feel evil oozing from the doorway. Whatever was on the other side, it wasn't good. The doors were covered in chains and locks, and hooks where 3 large logs went into place to barricade the door. But that didn't make any sense to him. This wasn't the front door. This door only went deeper into the structure. Those locks wouldn't be any good for keeping anything out, unless they were trying to keep something in. He realized, and for the first time started to struggle against his captors. Billy had thought he was going to get shot, or something of that nature. Not fed to something. That was a whole different ball game. A shark had already chewed him on, and he wasn't keen to have anything done like that ever again. Well, I guess he's got a little fight left in him after all. One of them laughed, and held on a little tighter. In his weakened state, Billy wasn't strong enough to break free from them. He wasn't even strong enough to stand on his own right now. Another man stood in front of the doors. He was older than the other two, with long gray blonde dreadlocks, and a woman stood beside him. They were both wearing robes and, like the others, had symbols painted all over their bodies. They smelled like they hadn't bathed in quite a while. The woman smiled at Billy. "Don't be afraid," she told him, smiling at him with yellow, rotted teeth. "This is a great honor. You're going to ascend." she told him, kissing his cheek and stroking his hair. Billy was shocked at the fact that she had a thick southern drawl. Who were these people? Shit was getting too weird, and Billy couldn't take any more. If this was a movie, this was usually the point where Andrew or Scott would explain to him what the hell was going on. If his tongue didn't feel so swollen and heavy, he'd have yelled at them. Screamed bloody murder, anything. But he didn't want the last thing he did in life to be drooling on himself. The man knelt down in front of him. In the torchlight, Billy could see that the shells and beads in the man's hair, and the strange tattoos that mottled his skin. Like the others, he was also definitely from somewhere else. He looked like a 40-year-old Scandinavian deadhead, who had graduated from the peace and love to something much darker. We mark him for the transition, the man said with a Swedish accent, and then reaching out with a dirty, gnarled finger, he painted something on Billy's forehead. And by this mark, he is holy. He is holy. The others repeated. And the holy go with the great God. The man continued. He goes to the deep dark. All hail the great God, the sparkling one, the star in the deep. Scythias be praised. The others chanted in unison, their voices echoing down the hallway. Before Billy could struggle again, the woman came in front of him and kissed him on the lips. Her tongue darting to and fro, Billy didn't know what to do. She left him just as quickly as she came, the smell of incense still cloying around him. He realized it wasn't just her. Underneath the BO, they all smelled like a head shop back at the beach. What was it about sandalwood? Patchouli. Not that it mattered now. The other two dragged him forward, and the door was held slightly open. He could feel the malevolence oozing out of the open doorway. Before Billy could scream, he was thrown into the dark room beyond. At first, he couldn't see anything. Then it was the whole room had lit up with thousands of twinkling little stars. It looked like they were floating freely. Only too late did he realize that they were attached to something massive, something that was moving towards him. Whatever it was, it glittered. He could hear it as it moved towards him, spindle-like legs clicking off the ground. For once he was happy he couldn't see it in the dark. But he could feel it rising in front of him, like a cobra ready to strike, like a tree of diamonds, towering over him. And when he opened his mouth to scream, because he couldn't keep it in any longer, that's when it pounced. It grabbed him in its hands and pulled him close. Its deformed mouth opened, and something slithered out akin to a mosquito sucker and slid down Billy's still screaming throat, cutting off the sound of his agony as the creature drained him of his soft vital organs. Billy was long dead before his body hit the ground, making a soft pinging sound. The cultist quickly came in at the sound of the creature finishing its feeding, and quietly they removed the solid gold statue of the one-handed man. "Hurry up!" the leader commanded the others. "We've got to melt it down," he said greedily, slapping the statue and hearing that solid dull thud. The sound of money. Knowing that soon they'd have to get the lumps of diamonds that the creature excreted. He rubbed his hands together excitedly, just thinking about it. "Scythias be praised," he muttered, on the way out the door. 9. Andrew woke up with the sun beaming down on him. Already he could feel his skin blistering under its harsh glare. He and Brittany had wandered through the jungle most of the night, until they'd finally found some fresh water. At least it had tasted fresh, which, after the hike into the jungle, that was all that mattered to them. He hoped they wouldn't end up getting sick from it. He'd seen enough survival shows to know that if they got sick out here, they'd be done for. After drinking their fill, they'd taken a brief break nestled up against a tree. Usually, Andrew would have been worried about bugs or other animals. Just the thought of bugs was enough to make his skin crawl, but that night, the only thing he was worried about was their friends. If they were even still alive. Had they been taken too? He didn't want to think about it. Whatever those people were, they terrified Tommy. Who was a murderer, kidnapper, and who knew what else? Andrew didn't even want to think about what those people could be capable of, or what they could be doing to his friends right now. Honestly, he wasn't that upset about Tommy being taken. Hell, he didn't even care what those people did to him. The only thing he did actually worry about was sharing the same fate. He spent half the night jumping at every little sound, waiting for one of the beach patrols to pounce down on them. For whatever reason, though, it seemed like those people only actually patrolled the beach. Did that mean there was something worse waiting for them in the jungle? Or perhaps they were simply confident that no one could get past them. Even though he didn't share that idea with Brittany, he could tell from the way she jumped at every bird call she was thinking the same thing. "Let's get one last drink and get out of here," Brittany told him, nodding over to the stream. "Deal," he replied, looking around, not wanting to spend any more time here than they had to. Sleeping here had been a mistake. There was something about the jungle that was too foreign, too alien. It assaulted his senses. He'd never felt so unwelcome in nature before. But something about the place made him feel uneasy, like they'd somehow overstayed their welcome. Andrew drank quickly, and even splashed some water around his body in an attempt to soothe his burning skin. It helped little, and still wasn't as good as a morning shower, but it'd have to do. He turned around while Brittany did the same, to give her some privacy. He tried to pretend he didn't hear the twig snap. Carefully he pulled out the rusty knife he'd taken from the boat. As the person got closer, he turned around, ready to stab the guy, and was suddenly staring down the barrel of an Alaska .47. The man holding it wasn't one of the people from the beach, but he was definitely just as dangerous. Maybe even more so if the gun and the grim expression were anything to go by. Two more people walked out of the jungle, into the small clearing. Two men with rifles, and the other wearing a Panama suit and a fedora pulled low over his brow. In one ear he had a diamond stud. Like Tommy, he was Bahamian. "That's a shitty knife, kid," the man said with a smile, looking at him and Brittany, who'd rose up from the stream and looked like she was ready to run. "Don't stop on our account," the man said, licking his lips. "We were enjoying the show, chica." "You must be Andres," Andrew told him evenly. That got the guy's attention. He instantly stopped leering at Brittany and turned back to face Andrew. The man nodded slowly. "You know me, but I don't know you." Andrew thought quickly. After all, no matter what other things this man did, he was most likely the best chance they had for getting off this island. "Tommy told us you'd be coming. He said you could get us off the island." Andres laughed. "He say that to you?" Andrew and Brittany nodded. "Where is Tommy?" Andres asked. "He smashed up my favorite boat, left it broken on the beach," he added with a laugh that Andrew thought was meant to sound jovial but sounded anything but. "The other people on the island took him," Andrew told him. "They got my friends too." Andrew realized that the guys with rifles looked nervous. They kept looking around the jungle, and clearly it wasn't Andrew and Brittany they were worried about. "I see," Andres said, looking around as though daring someone to attack him. "You are in luck, these people. I've got a bone to pick with them. The problem is I don't need you to." "The girl's pretty, boss," one of the riflemen said, and blew Brittany a kiss. Andres looked her over and shrugged. "If only we had the time." He raised his hands, more than likely to give a command to kill them. "We can pay," Andrew shouted and winced, half expecting to get cut down in a hail of gunfire. Andres clapped his hands excitedly. "Well, why didn't you say so?" he asked. "And your friends?" he asked them. Andrew and Brittany nodded. Scott's dad's some big-time lawyer and Ashley's parents are both doctors. Brittany spoke up, moving closer to Andrew. Andres beamed at them. "This is good news, my new friends, and once we get Tommy and your friends, we can leave this place. And then we will discuss how much money you are all worth." "You want to go find the people that live here?" Andrew asked him incredulously. Andres nodded. "Of course, and I don't need to find them. I know exactly where they are." The other gunman spoke up then. "Boss, maybe we just take these two. They pay, make up for the boat," he said hopefully. Andres laughed. "Jorge, you believe in too many old superstitions. Just like that silly old Swede, Come, we have to go settle our scores now. Show them who is in charge, yes? From the way that the two gunmen reacted, it was clear that this wasn't a question, but a command. Brittany and Andrew quickly fell in following behind Andres, while the one named Jorge led them through the jungle and the other one brought up the rear, where he spent more time staring at Brittany than watching for threats from the jungle. They walked further and further into the jungle, though Andrew realized it really wasn't that far. It was just the jungle was so dense it made it seem larger than it was. But in fact, on several occasions, they skirted the edges and he was able to catch glimpses of the ocean, proving that the island really wasn't as big as it seemed. They walked for about an hour before they come upon what looked like a campsite. A couple of tents with some people milling about, all at the base of what seemed to be some sort of Mayan-looking temple. A ziggurat. Andrew remembered trying to place the building style from what he remembered from school. Whatever it was definitely Mesoamerican, but he didn't remember learning about any South American civilizations that traveled the Caribbean. It was almost completely overgrown by vines and other foliage. He figured it would probably be all but impossible to see from the beach or from the sky unless you knew to look for it. Looking at the camp, the people were not at all like Andrew had expected them to be. For starters, most of them were white, and the tents he was pretty sure came from REI. But they were all painted up and chanting around a fire when they came upon them. Whatever they were doing, they definitely took it seriously. At first glance, he'd have thought they were ayahuasca hippies or something, but one look at the skulls and other things sitting around the camp, and he knew that whatever was going on here was much darker. He was still thinking about that when one of the chanters decided to grab a machete, and another grabbed a spear. Before he knew what was happening, the campers were charging them. Luckily for them, Andres and his men didn't hesitate. Andres didn't even shout a warning before Jorge and the other guy shot them dead. Brittany gasped and Andrew felt sick to his stomach. He'd never seen someone die before. Especially like that. The machete wielder's head literally exploded in a fine pink mist while his still spasming body took a few steps before collapsing on the ground. The spearman didn't fare much better. This did, however, have the intended effect. It made the other men and women of the camp stop moving and starting paying absolute attention to Andres. He pulled out his own pistol. It seems like we have ourselves a little fucking situation here. My boat is wrecked on your beach. And my man has been taken by your people. So I would recommend going to get the Swede, because as of right now we no longer have a deal. He told them. The assembled people stared at him. For a minute, it looked like they were going to try to charge them. He looked over at Andrew and Brittany. Am I speaking English? He asked them. Yes, Brittany answered him tentatively. Good. He replied, turned back around and shot one of the women. She screamed and fell gut-shot. She writhed on the ground in agony while the others simply watched. Now, for every minute that I have to wait, I'm going to kill one of you crazy fuckers, he said with a laugh. So someone go get the Swede. 10. Scott and Ashley were still awake in their cells, listening to Billy's screams as they slowly trailed off, before coming to an abrupt halt. No one needed to tell them what that meant. Billy was dead. Stupid, drunk, perverted, Billy had died in a way that echoed through the stone walls, had sent chills up their spines and had both Ashley and him clinging to each other. Whatever had happened when they took him out of his cage, Scott had the feeling he wouldn't have wished it on his worst enemy. We're next, Tommy said suddenly to no one in particular. Not looking up from his feet, Tommy was absent-mindedly picking at where his bone protruded through his leg, which had taken a really unhealthy pallor in the flickering torchlight. Most likely in the beginning stages of some sort of infection. Though if his naysaying was right, then he wouldn't have too long to worry about it. They took Billy because he was injured, so that probably meant that Tommy was next. He's right, if they come back in here, odds are they're taking one of us, Ashley whispered. Like him, she was breathing out of her mouth. At some point Tommy had shit himself, and between that and his festering wound, the cramped room had an ungodly stench. Scott shrugged. He didn't know what to say. It wasn't like he knew a way to get out of here. Fact was, he wasn't 100% sure that he wasn't in shock. It would explain why he wasn't panicking. Shouldn't he be panicking? A normal person would probably panic, he thought. Wouldn't that make sense in this situation? But honestly, he couldn't bring himself to do anything. It was as if he had come resigned to the whole situation. Because the one thing that seemed completely certain at this point was that they were going to die here, and that there was nothing he could do about it. He was on the verge of telling Ashley this when the cultist from earlier barged in. However, this time they weren't alone. With them was a thin, wiry man with blonde dreads, in which many shells and beads swung freely. The woman with him didn't look much better. She had also had things in her hair, but it was hard to tell what it was. But Scott would have sworn on the Bible that it had seaweed and fish bones strung through it. We can take them all now, the Swedish man mused. If we put it off, we might lose the chance. The great shelled one won't like this, the woman pleaded with him. He likes time in between his offerings. He shook his head as the two goons unlocked their cells and Tommy's too. It doesn't matter as long as some of the faithful survive. We knew this day was coming. Our God who walks the depths will understand. The woman looked at the floor, resigned. As you say, great priest. You too carry that one, the Swede demanded, pointing at Tommy. Together with a lot of effort, Ashley and Scott could get Tommy up. With him being dragged between them, the smell was even worse up close. Thankfully, Tommy didn't fight them. Scott's eyes were tearing up from it, and Ashley dry heaved a little as they dragged him down the hallway. Even the two big guards seemed to keep their distance. Tommy was lost to it all. Whatever force of will he'd had earlier to keep him talking was now gone. Instead, he let them pull him down the hallway mutely. Maybe it was because he knows what's about to happen, Scott thought, trying to explain the other mont's behavior to himself. If that was it, then whatever it was must truly be terrible to make someone such as Tommy have a complete mental breakdown just at the mere thought of it. Though he couldn't see her face, he couldn't help but wonder if Ashley was thinking the same thing. Part of him wondered if they could break into a run, but he quickly discarded that idea. The two guards seemed to be nothing but chiseled muscle, and even if they got away, this place looked like a labyrinth. Scott didn't even remember being brought here. He had a feeling they'd just wind up getting lost if they made an escape attempt now. Still, they needed to escape sooner rather than later. They came to a halt. In front of them was a giant doorway, with a log through slats. Several others lined the wall, clarifying that whatever was beyond those doors, these people wanted to keep it in there. He was happy when the party turned off to the left, into a narrow opening that Scott hadn't even seen at first. The door had felt wrong, and Scott swore he could feel whatever was behind it waiting for them. The room they walked into was much larger than the room with the cells. Unlike that room, this one was also lined with strange hieroglyphs depicting all sorts of sea life, especially some sort of crab-lobster-looking thing. On any other day, this would have been pretty interesting to Scott, but for some reason now it only heightened his fear, making him feel for sure that whatever they were about to see could never be unseen. Whatever was about to happen, it would haunt him for the rest of his life, if he survived. In the middle of the room was what looked like a tidal pool. All around the room were gold objects and glittering gemstones. But here he could definitely smell the brackish sea. They motioned for them to put Tommy down by the pool, and they did. Then they stood back. The guards gripped them tight, cutting off all hope of escape. The Swedish man smiled and chanted something in a guttural language of the like Scott had never heard. Then, using a large conch shell, he dipped it into the water and drank it. From the great primordial sea, the shelled god will preserve us. The collector of the dead in the briny deep will guide us. All who follow me into this shoal will be kings and queens of the reef. All who bear the mark of Claude Lord. Hail Scythias, hail the Claude god, hail the great shelled one. The others repeated it, and bared what Scott could only assume was the mark they were talking about, a weird symbol that seemed branded into their skins. Something that hurt his eyes the more he tried to look at it. What the fuck was going on? He wondered. Beside him, Ashley had closed her eyes and was clasping the necklace depicting the Star of David that she always wore. A Hanukkah gift from her parents. Although she'd always made the point of saying she wasn't really religious, but it looked like that had changed today. Scott swallowed and was wondering if maybe he should try to pray to someone too. After all, it couldn't hurt, but before he could choose between Jesus and Buddha, the Swede produced a knife and slit Tommy's stomach open, pulling out his intestines while Tommy grunted on the ground, going deeper into the shock as the meaty, bloody loops of rope-like intestine went deeper into the pool of water. We feed the little crawlers, the carrion feeders, the keepers of deep secrets, so that you might bestow unto us power to overcome our enemies. The Swede shouted out frenziedly, as his hands darted in and out of Tommy's wound, pulling out more and more, only to let it disappear into the apparently deep puddle. The room seemed to fill with a fetid musk. All around them came high-pitched chittering sound. Scott realized it wasn't coming from around them, no, it was echoing up from the pool. Suddenly Tommy jerked. His intestines pulled tight like a fishing line, before he was suddenly and violently pulled into the pool. One last scream escaped his lips as he went under the water. Ashley had never even opened her eyes. Scott wondered if he should have closed his. Our offering has been accepted, the Swede said with a smile. Scott wondered if that meant he and Ashley were about to share the same fate as Tommy when the sound came back, along with the smell. The entire room now smelled like a dead fish, mixed with a tidal pool that had baked in the sun. The Swede smiled in the torchlight, their skin squirmed, then cracked and bled. The woman with the dreads fell to the ground as her teeth came out of her gums, clacking against the stone. And the guards let go of them as their hands broke and then fused together. At that moment, Scott didn't care what was happening. He'd finally seen enough. For once, all he wanted was to be at his dad's law firm. Before he could make up his mind to run, Ashley grabbed him and pulled him through the tiny entrance, just as the Swede and the others made that same high-pitched chittering sound. Neither Scott nor Ashley looked back as they ran through the temple as fast as they could. 11. Brittany didn't even wince as another gunshot split the air and echo around her. Nor did she look away as yet another body dropped. She thought maybe she should feel something for these people. This cult. She'd wept a little, silently, as Andre had killed the first three, but now it just seemed like part of the background. Beside her, Andrew sat looking at the ground angrily. Perhaps he felt guilty for getting them in this mess with Andre. But it wasn't his fault. In fact, Brittany realized that part of her was happy that Andre and his men were so preoccupied with the cultist in the camp, because at least it kept their attentions away from them. And the more she watched numbly, she realized that Andre was a man of his word. And she also knew that she certainly didn't want any attention from Andre or his other men. Beneath that suave business facade, Andre was a monster. It was more than clear that he actually enjoyed killing people. She didn't even want to think what that meant for them once they were all off the island. It made a lot of sense when she thought about Tommy. After all, he'd been more afraid of Andre than the psychos on the beach. She just hoped that they'd gotten here in time to save the others, and who knows, maybe after years of therapy she'll recover from all this. She almost laughed at the thought. Almost. Andrew nudged her. Hey, while they're down there maybe we can get away, he whispered. Brittany shook her head. No, I think that's what he wants us to do, and I don't want to get shot. Besides, that's our ride off the island. He's a psycho, Andrew told her in an angry whisper. If we don't get away now, we might never have another chance. She shrugged and looked away. Look around and be real. Better them than us, she told him with a sad smile. He shook his head, his eyes wide, as though he were seeing her for the first time. That's right, she thought, take it all in. Brittany didn't care anymore. She was done pretending to be nice. At this point, none of that social bullshit mattered. Morals, fuck them. She was going to do whatever she had to survive. And if a bunch of crazy cultists had to die so she could get her friends back and get off the island, that was a sacrifice she was more than willing to make. And if Andrew didn't like, she didn't care. As long as they got off the island alive, that's all that mattered. Before he could say anything, an awful wail echoed from the temple. It was a sound that no human could have made. The sound tore through the camp, leaving Andrew and Brittany to clutch their ears in a desperate attempt to ward off the awful noise. The cultists weren't so lucky. They began to roll on the ground, clutching at the brands burned into their arms. At first, she hadn't paid attention to them until she realized that all of them had them. Some had multiple brands and tattoos alike. Some sort of religious symbol, she supposed. But now they were holding them like they burned. Then they started to make other sounds. Like some sort of demonic inverted wail, like their throats were being torn apart. On the ground, the cultists began to make a strange burbling, chattering sound. "What the fuck is going on?" Andre demanded, backing up to where Brittany and Andrew now stood. His two goons were with him. One of them crossed himself, then started to pray in Spanish. The cultists' bodies seemed to elongate and snap. Some of them flipped backwards on themselves as their backs snapped in two, hard lobster-like legs pushing out the sides of their bodies. Their heads hung upside down as their teeth fell out. In their place came claw-like appendages that waved in the air wildly, looking for prey to pull apart. And the rest grew hard shells that burst through their skin. Veins sticking out on their heads as their eyes pushed from their heads on little stalks like crabs. Brittany was thankful that she had nothing on her stomach as she watched their hands fuse together and become claws, the hard pinchers pushing through the skin in painful waves of gore. "Shoot them!" Andre shouted, and shot one of the newly walking cultists in the face. It was one of the upside-down creatures. It went down with a shriek in a tangled heap of long, hard legs. The sound of the gun brought them all back to reality, as they realized how close the cultists were to them. The cultist, too, seemed to realize it. That same keening wail split the air. Brittany had heard it before at a fish market. It was the sounds crabs made all together when out of the water. Lobsters, too. The cultist charged them, and like a bolt, she and Andrew took off, heading to the only place that seemed to offer any sort of protection. Behind them were the sounds of gunfire. It seemed the others had decided to run as well. They tore past some of the still changing cultists, and up the hard stone steps of the old temple, taking them 2 and 3 at a time. She didn't stop to look back. At the top, it took both her and Andrew a minute to get the door open. It was heavier than she'd imagined, hard stone doors. Perfect for keeping the cultist out. Or her in. She thought with a sudden surge of panic. As soon as the stone doors were open, the stagnant air of the stone temple hit them. It smelled briny and brackish like the underside of a boat. One covered with thousands of festering barnacles, she thought with a shudder. For a moment, she thought of turning and running. Some primal fear telling her to take her chances outrunning the cultists. Whatever was in here was worse. She could feel it in her bones. Inside these walls, they'd find the answer to what happened to the cultist. Now she wondered if that was something she even wanted to know. Before she could move one way or the other, Andre and the other man shoved her and Andrew inside. "Come on," he yelled. They were about to close the doors. Gunshots rang out on the stairs. The other guy, the big guy Jorge, stood there wounded, fighting the cultists with every step. Some died, others merely took a few steps back as the buckshot bounced off of their shell-covered bodies. They knew he wasn't going to make it. Brittany could only watch as the disappointment and betrayal played out across Jorge's face through the crack of the closing door. The last thing she saw of him was the claw that shot out of his chest and pulled him into the horde of cultists. Then the doors banged shut. Without missing a beat, Andres and the other guy slid the heavy log into place, sealing the entrance, trapping them inside the cold, dark temple. 12. Scott and Ashley kept running long after the sound stopped. He wasn't even sure that anyone had been chasing them. He tried not to think about what he'd seen in that room, how they'd all started to change, but he couldn't. Whatever they'd just witnessed shouldn't have been possible. All he wanted to do now was get out of here, and put as much distance between them and this island as possible. But the truth was, they were lost. Neither one of them had been fit to pay attention when they were brought in, and the temple was also larger than they had expected, making them both wonder just how many cultists actually called this place home. At first he'd figured it was just a ruin, but after witnessing that transformation, Scott knew it was a temple, and he hoped to never come face to face with what they worshipped here. They stopped in an alcove to catch their breath. He quietly peeked around the corner to see if the Swede or any more of his clawed horrors were after them. Just thinking about the way those people's bodies had broken and reshaped themselves was enough to make Scott want to hurl. Especially since the worst part of it had been the smell, as organs had burst and shredded themselves. He was just happy after witnessing that he wasn't some sort of gibbering mess. If he'd been asked before this trip, he'd have said monsters were humans like Tommy who preyed on other people. But now he knew better. He understood why Tommy had been so scared. Monsters were real. And they weren't human at all. They were something much, much worse. We can't just keep running. We are going to get exhausted, he said to Ashley as they got ready to run again. You have a better idea? She asked him, still panting. Neither one of them was in terrible shape, but they'd also been shipwrecked, kept in a cage, starved, and almost murdered. If they weren't careful, they'd end up dying of exhaustion long before the Swede and his monsters caught them. Yeah, catch our breath and find a way out of here. Escape isn't any good if we end up running straight into more of those things, he said to her, trying to keep his voice low so it didn't echo off the walls. If we aren't careful, we could wind up running in circles down here until we pass out or worse, get caught. We need to stop panicking and start playing it smart. She looked at him for a moment when he said that. There was fear in her eyes. If he could see himself, he was sure he was probably mirroring them. Scott, what in God's name are those things? He shook his head, trying to find the right words. I honestly don't think God has anything to do with whatever is going on here. He wanted to say more, to take her into his arms, to comfort her, to be comforted himself by her, but there were sounds from down the hall. Something was coming towards them. Something that probably wasn't human. Making it clear that while their pursuers had fallen behind, they hadn't given up, not yet, not by a long shot. Even in the dim torchlight, they could make out the two hulking guards who were now just masses of shell, claws, and flesh, as they ran down the hallway straight towards them, making a noise that sounded like someone screaming underwater. They couldn't just keep running straight. Scott and Ashley dove into a side tunnel, and then into another series of smaller chambers, until they found themselves in a room like the one they'd originally escaped from. This one, however, was much different. Instead of a pool of water in the middle of it, there was a hole leading to what appeared to be another cavern system. It was wide enough for them to jump into it, and the fall didn't seem far enough down that it would hurt them. Where those caverns would lead them to, on the other hand, was something Scott didn't want to think about it. He wanted to get out of here as quickly as possible, not go further down into the island. They looked at each other for a moment, unsure of what to do. Jump into the mysterious hole in the ground, or stay and face the creatures that were coming to get them. Their answer was decided for them, when all of a sudden one of the hulking creatures entered the doorway. Scott knew what he had to do. He grabbed a torch off the wall as the thing lumbered towards him and threw it down into the hole. Then grabbed Ashley and jumped just as the creature entered the room, swiping a claw at the place where they had been standing, barely missing them as they disappeared down into the tunnel system below. It was not a short fall like he had originally thought. They slapped against the walls of the tunnel, which jarred Scott's elbow painfully before exiting into an open cavern. Below them, they heard the unmistakable hiss of the torch hitting water and going out. Scott didn't even have time to worry about that, as he fell into the water below, water that they hadn't noticed when looking down. A large splash shot beside him as Ashley hit the water, and then a third more ominous splash somewhere else he couldn't see. Had one of the creatures followed them down? If so, he didn't want to meet it in the water if he could help it. He didn't have time to dwell on it, as he kicked his way towards what seemed like some sort of shore. Taking in deep, ragged breaths as he went, Scott had to stop himself from gagging as his senses were assaulted with a putrid fetid stink that seemed to be coming from all around them. Rubbing the salt water out of his eyes, he was surprised to see that overhead was some sort of creatures that gave off a bioluminescence light which lit the whole cavern. Everything glowed in an eerie green light. Plenty enough for them to be able to see, even if it was somewhat dim. Ashley swam easily beside him, but they could also both hear something swimming towards them, and the last thing Scott wanted to be right now was in the water. They just made it up onto the shore when Ashley screamed out in terror. That's when the creature pulled itself up from the water. It was awful to behold. There was nothing remotely human about its face as it reared back to stab at them with its massive claws. It suddenly jerked back into the water. Then screamed, or at least that's what Scott thought the high-pitched whistling sound it made must have been, as something bigger than it dragged it under and out of sight. They watched, frozen in fear, until the bubbles on the surface stopped. Ashley and Scott sat there, heaving on the hard floor of the cavern, the sides of which were covered with barnacles and what he was pretty sure were precious gems. "I guess it's like my dad always says," Ashley told him tiredly as she helped him to his feet. "There's always a bigger fish," she said, a small grin. "Ha ha," Scott replied and cast a wary glance over at the water. "Whatever happens though, I want you to know I'm not getting back in there." "Agreed," she replied wholeheartedly. Then, surprising them, both slipped her hand in his as they walked along the cavern floor as far from the water's edge as they could get. "No sense of beating around the bush," she told him with a sad smile. "After all, we might not make it out of here." "Don't say things like that. We'll find a way. We've come too far to give up now," he told her tiredly, though he honestly didn't believe it himself. The cavern widened ahead in front of them, and they could see many golden bodies of people and diamonds covering the floor. "What the hell?" Scott wondered aloud, breathless at the display of riches in front of them. A handful of the diamonds, and he wouldn't have to worry about working at his father's law firm. And just half of one of the golden statues would probably be enough to ensure that he never had to work again. "These are statues of people," Ashley told him. "Why are there golden statues down here?" "Not the weirdest thing we've seen today," he told her confidently. Though he'd take finding golden statues every day compared to the other things that they'd seen. These looked old and worn. It also looked like something large had walked over them, enough time that some of them were actually dented. Luckily for them, whatever it wasn't anywhere to be found. Then they saw why. At the other end of the cavern where it forked, there was a door. Just like the one that was upstairs. Whatever was down here. They trapped it, he muttered. Luckily for them, the door was closed. "And look here," she said, pointing at the wall, on which there were more pictographs, these showing people being turned into treasure by an enormous beast from the sea that called this cave home. Until the temple was built around it, and it was eventually trapped and fed by the people, who in turn took its mark, only to be turned into what looked like strange sea creatures. "It shows them returning to the sea," she said, pointing out another section. "This is the one that worries me," he told her. It was a scene in which the large creature was surrounded by little crab-looking things that ate the golden bodies and regular ones alike. "What did that Swede talk about, little carrion eaters?" he asked. Ashley swore. "I really want to get out of this fucking cave," she told him, panic slowly edging into her voice. Just then, as though their prayers were answered, they felt a breeze waft through from the other fork in the tunnel. It smelled like fresh air in the beach. "An exit," Scott swore and grabbed Ashley's hand, and together they ran as fast as they could towards freedom. 13. Inside the temple, Andrew and the others kept watching the door until it became clear that nothing was coming through. The monsters outside, having given up trying to claw their way in. Andrew still wasn't sure what had happened outside, but luckily for them, it looked like the change had given any of them super strength. Which was good news for them, but at the same time, it now meant they were trapped inside. "We need to find that fucking Swede," Andre told them. "That asshole, he'd do all of this, he said, gesturing angrily around him. "Who's the Swede?" Andrew asked him. "He's their leader," Andre told him, looking down the temple hallway into the gloom. "We had a deal with me and him. I knew they were doing some crazy stuff out here. But gold's gold, I never believed in the stories," Andre told them. "I just thought they were traffickers or something." Pablo, the last surviving member of Andre's goons, spat on the ground and reloaded his rifle. "I never believed what they said about this island either, boss." He crossed himself. "They say the island is evil, but the temple is cursed. Some say the devil himself lives in the temple. Me and the devil are old friends." Andre joked, "Whatever is here, we'll send it to hell on our way out. But first we find that Swede and no more fairy tales shoot anything with claws," he told Pablo pragmatically. Andrew was about to argue, but Brittany cut them off. "He's right, Andrew, plus whoever the Swede is, he probably knows another way to get out of here." He locked eyes with Brittany, but knew she was right. There was no way that they would survive outside on their own, and more importantly, Andre still had a boat somewhere on the island. Until they found out where, they couldn't afford to try to make a break for it. The temple was a twisting labyrinth of rooms, hallways, and stairwells. Every wall was laden with what looked like pictographs of sea creatures, people, and stuff that looked like a mashup of the two. Some which appeared eerily similar to the creatures they'd fled from. They started to check the rooms one by one. Using the torches on the wall gave them plenty of light, but as the shadows flickered on the walls, Andrew desperately wished they had flashlights. Last thing he wanted was to be lost down here in the dark. Goosebumps puckered up and down his arms. He was unable to shake the feeling that they were trespassing somewhere where they did not belong. Images on the walls showed all the gory ways that trespassers were dealt with. For all of Andre's bravado, it was clear to see that Pablo and him were just as shaken as he and Brittany were. All of them walked quietly around halls. It was eerily silent as they made their way further into the temple. In the next room they checked, they found a bunch of clothes and stuff that made it clear that this was where most of the cultists slept while inside the temple. There were mattresses and sleeping bags, and the whole room smelled like unclean bodies, human refuse, and seawater. At this point, he preferred the smell of the seawater. Whatever religion these people followed, apparently didn't agree that cleanliness was close to godliness. The next room after that was filled with cells. It was clear this was where they kept people, for whatever it was that they did with them. If Andre and the other guy knew what happened to the people, they traded to the Swede. They weren't sharing. So Andrew didn't know if it was a good thing that Scott and Ashley weren't in there. Brittany didn't say a word. Instead, she just pivoted and followed the others out of the room. Whatever had gotten into her, one thing was for sure, he didn't like it. She'd quickly gone from sweet to downright cold and callous. He wondered if it was the island that did that to her, or if she'd always been that way, and they'd just never noticed it before. He was pretty sure that she'd leave them all behind, if it meant getting off the island. Leaving the room with the cells, they kept heading down the hallway to what appeared to be a set of massive double doors with logs through them to keep them barred. Barred against what? He wondered as they looked at it. He didn't think he wanted to find out. Whatever was behind that door had clearly spooked the cultist enough that they'd locked it away. Maybe Pablo was right, and the devil was down here. They were about to investigate when Pablo got Andre's attention from one of the rooms down to the left. "Boss, you've got to see this," he said and walked back in. Turning away from the large barred door, they headed towards Pablo. Andrew sighed in relief as they walked away from it. The last thing he wanted to do was go in there if they could avoid it. Walking inside, they all gasped at the sight of it. The room was filled with gold and jewels, which spilled all over the floor. Golden statues stood either erect or were broken on the ground. Andre and Pablo stuffed their pockets. Andrew reached out, and he recoiled, unsure as to why all the gold was shaped like body parts. Some of the statues had their stomachs broken open wide, diamonds and other precious jewels spilled out of them. He'd never seen anything like it. Though being fair, he'd never seen half of what he'd seen today before, and honestly he wished it had stayed that way. "Andrew, look, it's Billy." Brittany said, pointing at what appeared to be another mangled gold statue. Then he looked closer, and sure enough it looked exactly like Billy, his mouth now forever opened in what appeared to be an eternal scream. "What the hell?" he said aloud. What could turn a person into gold? Or into the creatures like the ones they'd seen outside? Andrew didn't want to think about it, not until he was far away from this place. From deeper in the room there was a stirring sound, and from behind a pile of gemstones on the other side of the pool in the middle of the floor, one of those things rose up. It roared at them and slowly crossed the room. Andrew was frozen as he stared at it. He supposed that at one time it had been a woman. Some of the features were still there, but all he saw was the long lobster-like legs jutting evilly out of her sides, and her upside-down clawed mouth burbled incoherently as the small claws jutting out of them flailed around looking for flesh to tear. She came towards them with her clawed hands outstretched, her long reddish dreaded hair falling around the ground like a mop. Before she made it all the way across the room, Pablo blew her head off with his rifle and kept shooting until she stopped moving. "Good work, Pablo," Andre told the other man. Pablo was about to reply, but the waters in the pool started to churn wildly. Creatures akin to small Dungeness crabs crawled out and swarmed towards them. They quickly covered Pablo. He screamed and thrashed as they pinched and pulled him apart faster than Andrew thought possible, and finally drug his still thrashing body into the pool of water along with the body of the woman. Andrew and the others backed out of the little room and out into the hallway, not taking their eyes off of the pool in case those things came back. "Hey, look!" Brittany exclaimed, pointing at the large barred door. They all turned. The logs were gone, and the door was slowly creaking open. Andres had his pistol in his hand and spun around at the sound of footfalls behind them echoing from the way they came. He was bringing it to aim on the creature, but it was faster. One of its claws snapped out with a savage strike. There was a loud clack as the claws crunched together, easily cutting through Andre's flesh. Hot red blood flashed across Andrew's face and splashed on Brittany as well. Andre opened his mouth to scream, but only made a soft, low whine as he looked at the place where his right hand used to be. They could only watch as the other claw swatted out and clacked close around Andre's neck, shutting off that whine forever. His head rolled uselessly onto the floor with a thud. They backed up as the creature advanced on them, stepping over Andre's body, which dropped lifelessly onto the temple floor. Behind them, the large double doors swung all the way open and the hallway filled with an unnatural chill. The creature stopped advancing on them as something else walked out into the hall. Unlike the others, he still looked somewhat human, except for the tiny clawed hands that had sprouted out along his body and seemed to move of their own violation. And the giant, somewhat fleshy, pulsating hermit shell was on his back. "Hello," he said in a Swedish accent. "We've been expecting you. Now prepare to be offered to the great clawed Lord of the Deep," he said in a voice that sounded as though it were underwater. Behind him in the shadows, something massive started to walk out of the doorway. And as it made its way into the light of the torches, Andrew and Brittany both screamed louder than they ever thought possible. 14. Ashley was ready to weep for joy as the sunlight hit her face. It was so bright that both she and Scott had to stop and cover their eyes. Outside, gulls squawked overhead and everything appeared to be perfectly normal. They were on what looked to be cliff faces with large, well-trodden paths that would take them down to the beach. They still had to be careful on the way down. One wrong move and they would be in the water, which was the last thing that either of them wanted. After seeing the creatures in the temple, there was no telling what might be lurking down in the water. Instead of heading down, however, she and Scott followed a well-worn path up the side of the cliff and far away from the water. Once on top, it was clear to see that they had come out almost on the other side of the island. In the distance they could see part of the temple, but even at a distance it was still far too close for either one of them to be comfortable. Were there tunnels under the entire island? Ashley wondered, concerned that the creatures could somehow circle around them without either of them being aware. She was done with surprises at this point. Hand in hand, they ventured into the jungle, keeping the coast well in sight as they headed as far away from the temple as possible. Neither of them spoke. They couldn't hear anything else walking around, but that didn't mean they weren't laying in wait. "Hey," Scott whispered loudly and pulled her back to point at something on the ground. At first, she didn't see what he was looking at, but then she saw it. Someone had made a path through there recently. From the looks of some of the plants, it was clear they'd used machetes and hadn't cared if anyone knew they were coming. "This doesn't look like the cultists," Ashley told him. Scott smiled. "Right? But if they had machetes, maybe they meant to come here." "So?" she asked him, not seeing how someone coming to this evil place intentionally was a good thing. "So they had to have a way to get here," he replied, a toothy grin across his face. Before she could stop herself, Ashley pulled him into a tight embrace, overjoyed at the thought of finally getting away from this place for good. When she pulled away, she was grinning and Scott was blushing so much that it was visible through his sunburn. Quickly following the path, they soon came to a clearing, one that seemed to open into a little bay. Scott once again pointed at something in the distance. Covering her eyes with her hands, Ashley looked in the direction he was pointing and tears of joy stung her eyes. Further down in the bay was a boat. A big, beautiful, still floating boat. One that could take them back to safety. Just as they headed down towards it, the ground trembled. Her first thought was that it was an earthquake, but then she realized it wasn't coming from the ground at all, but from the temple looking back. They could only watch as the top of it fell in on itself. Since they didn't see anyone else on the boat or on the beach, they jumped in the water and swam out to it. Climbing aboard, they soon found that it was in perfect working order. Scott had driven boats before, but only on a lake, and they'd been much smaller. Luckily for them both, Ashley had plenty experience from sailing with her parents and knew how to navigate around the ocean. She also knew how to turn it on, which was more than Scott knew how to do. Whoever had left hadn't seemed worried about it getting stolen, and even left the keys in it. Ashley wondered if that was from confidence, or if they too thought they might need to make a speedy getaway. Once she had the boat started, they headed around the coast of the island back towards the temple. Neither of them wanted to, but it had to be done if they were going to have a chance at getting home. Ashley figured they shouldn't go out into the open water until they got to the spot they'd originally washed up at. That way, they would at least have a decent starting point to plot their course from. "I don't like this," Scott said again, sitting beside her with his arms crossed. His eyes warily scanning the coast for any sign that the creatures were out and about. Deep down, Ashley didn't either. She didn't have any delusions where the creatures were concerned. She fully understood that those things could probably not only outswim them, but could also most likely sink the boat before they ever had a chance to make it out into deeper water. Rounding the coast, they could now see the front of the temple. It was strange, more like something she would have expected to see in South America or Mexico, not in the middle of the Bahamas, but nothing about this place made sense anyway. From where they sat on the boat, they could see something beginning to emerge from the front of the temple. She watched, unable to look away as the temple shook, and out of the large cracked doorway a creature emerged. To her it looked like a massive multi-clawed lobster. Its shell was black as midnight, and all along its body things glittered and glistened like thousands of dying stars. The creature crawled into the sea and disappeared under the waves without casting them a secondary glance. Hopefully, going back to where it came from, never to return. Behind the giant's lobster creature came a trail of the cultist turned into creatures. It looked like they were dancing as their broken bodies ambled after the creature on unsteady chitinous legs. One by one, they followed it into the sea. "It's just like the pictures in the caves," Scott exclaimed with a gasp. "I know, let's just hope that wherever those things are going, it's far away from us," Ashley told him solemnly as they watched the last of the creatures get into the water. "Agreed," Scott replied. "Do you think that anyone will ever believe us?" "Would you?" she asked, turning to look at him, while keep the one eye on the water in case any of the creatures resurfaced. "Nope, not even a little," he said with a laugh. "This trip is really going to rack up those therapy hours." "At least you can bill it to the company," she told him. "True," he said, for once not upset about the prospect of working for his dad. In fact, the thought of a boring office job where nothing ever happened, like lobster-shaped sea gods, seemed downright wonderful to him right now. They heard a shout, and someone started yelling at them. "Guys, wait up!" Brittany called out, and as she was running down to the beach, she jumped into the water and quickly swam out to the boat. Both of them helped to pull her over to the side as she wept and shook. "How?" Ashley asked once they had her in on board. Brittany looked awful, though Ashley doubted she looked much better. The other girl's cheeks were laden with tears. "I ran when the temple came down. Those things didn't care about us anymore," she told them, and then looked over at the boat. "Can we please just get out of here?" "Yeah," Ashley told her and went back to the console. "Wait a minute," Scott cut in. "Where's Andrew?" Brittany sniffled and looked at her feet. He didn't make it," she told them and threw her arms around herself. Ashley glared at Scott, hoping he'd get the hint and drop it. Thinking that would have been obvious, but then she felt guilty. Remembering that throughout college, those two had always been inseparable. A part of Ashley wanted to go comfort him because she'd just lost a friend, but Scott had lost a brother. But there would be plenty of time for that once they were safe. Ashley watched as he left Brittany and went to search below decks. Something they probably should have done before starting it. Luckily, unlike Tommy's boat, this one had food and water, and besides from some guns, they were happy that it didn't have any other surprises waiting aboard. "I'll drive for a while. This thing has a fancy GPS and basically a full tank of gas," Ashley told the others, happily. Scott smiled. "Finally, things are looking up," he said, taking the seat beside her. "Wake me up when it's my turn to drive." Beside him, she laughed. "Are you sure you're even going to sleep?" "Nope," he told her honestly. "But I've got to try. I'm running on fumes. Seriously, wake me up when you want to switch, okay? Even heroes need rest." Ashley smiled at him. "Okay. How long till we get there?" Brittany asked, after Scott disappeared below deck. Ashley shrugged and looked back at the GPS. 4, maybe 5 hours, as long as we don't run into crazy weather or anything. And that's hoping that this thing is even taking us to the right place. "If we do," Brittany said ominously, leaning forward in her seat, clearly worried. Ashley looked back at her. "Then we hunkered down and radioed the lifeguard," she told her, not adding what she knew they were both thinking. The part where they all hoped that nothing climbed up from the depths and dragged them down to the bottom of the sea. As long as she was moving, Ashley didn't have to worry about what was under her, but if they had to stop for any reason, she honestly didn't know if her nerves could take it. "On the bright side, it's a nice sunny calm day out," Brittany added, clearly trying to lighten the mood. Ashley gave her a small smile. "Yeah, there is that. Though once we get to shore, I can honestly say this is the last time I'm stepping on a boat." Brittany looked shocked. "But you love sailing." "Not anymore." 15. Scott had tried to sleep up on the chair, but after he almost fell off twice, Ashley told him to go down below. He didn't even make it to one of the bedrooms near the bow, and instead plopped down on the first couch he came across. He hadn't been asleep that long when he felt someone's hands moving up and down his body, caressing him. At first, he thought it was a dream, and then he thought it was Ashley. As the hands went lower and started pulling off his pants, he opened his eyes. His pleasure quickly turned to shock. There on the couch with him was Brittany. "What are you doing?" he asked her and ground as her hand found its way lower. She smiled. "I just wanted to feel something, you know." Before he could stop her, she moved atop him. It was then he realized that she too was mostly naked. Mounting him, he moaned in ecstasy, feeling guilty knowing that Ashley was above deck driving the boat. But damn it, he wanted to feel something too, something good, so he clung to her like she clung to him. She rode him almost mechanically, and as he watched, she removed her shirt. He gasped as he took in every inch of her body with his hands and mouth. Until they found something that made his stomach ache. Confused, he felt like he might scream as his eyes settled on her stomach. There, plain as day, was the mark he'd seen on the bodies of the cultists in the temple. She was one of them. Scott tried to push her off. She held on tighter as she rode him harder and harder, his pleasure turning to pain as she ground into him. He struggled under her as she changed right on top of him, her skin sliding off as a hard shell came out from under it, her hands turning into claws as her fingers broke intertwined and became something else altogether. Something horrible. Her eyes, even in the dim light of the boat, took on a glassy black sheen as long stalks pushed free from her sockets. Her body shuddered as her abdomen twisted, and finally he was able to push her off of him. She fell to the floor with a thump and rolled on the ground. Pulling up his pants and running towards the door of the room, Scott heard the creature that used to be Brittany rise up. As he ran to the steps, suddenly a hot slash cut across his back. He could feel the hot warmth dripping down his back, but knew he couldn't stop now. He had to warn Ashley. Behind him in the room, he could hear as Brittany tried to come after him again, only to fall with the rocking of the boat. She wasn't used to the change yet, so he was able to get away, but even he knew that in moments when she got used to it, she'd be a killing machine. Then they would be in real trouble, because they didn't have anywhere else to run. He didn't like the idea of fighting one of those things in close quarters, but he also knew that they wouldn't be able to outswim it. He scrabbled up the stairs and out onto the open boat, screaming as he slammed the door shut, knowing that the fiberglass door would do little to hold the creature out for long. Ashley, no longer driving the boat, had rushed to meet him, apparently drawn to his scream. "What's wrong?" she asked him, looking around. He stood there gasping with his back pushed up against the door. From the other side, he could hear the creature making its way up the stairs. "What are you doing?" "Brittany's down there," Ashley asked, getting closer. Looking for a minute, like she wanted to make a move to open the door. "No, she's not," he told her. "Not anymore." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, jumping back from the door as something large slammed against it from the other side. "Look, I don't know how, but Brittany's changed. She's one of them now," he told her, hoping that she believed him. "What do you mean, one of them?" Ashley asked him. "Brittany came to the island with us. She can't have changed into one of those creatures," she argued. "We were separated. Who knows what they did to he or to Andrew?" he shot back. Ashley looked like she wanted to say more, when all of a sudden, the tip of a monstrous claw came through the door. Andrew looked at it and felt sick. If it had come through a minute earlier, he would have been skewered. The claw pulled itself out, and as they listened, the creature began moving around down below. It charged the hatch a few more times, but against all odds it held. Dented and pierced, but still there for now, but it was clear to both of them that it wouldn't hold much longer. They both jumped as the tip of a claw pierced the door again, twisting and tearing like a demonic can opener as it tried to force an opening. It didn't work. The creature's attempt at widening the holes failed. Looking at it, Scott wondered how many more holes the creature would have to put through the door before it finally buckled. The creature on the other side made an unearthly sound, and they backed up. He could hear its many legs shuffling off the floor. "It's going to charge again," Scott said grimly. With as much momentum as it could get, he figured. Of course, the problem for them was that they had nowhere else to go, except the water. But this time there wasn't any island in the distance for them to swim to, and no one was out here looking for them. Behind him, Ashley picked up a large pole that was stashed in a side compartment. One of the ones used to hook things floating in the water, and held it out in front of her menacingly. "Was there another one of those things down there?" he asked her somewhat meekly. She shook her head. "No, sorry. If it makes you feel any better, I don't think it's going to be much help." He shrugged. "If I'd been thinking clearer, I'd have grabbed one of the guns from down below. On the bright side, at least she can't use them either." Ashley offered both of them, staring ahead and watching as the tip of the other claw pierced through the hatch and began to try to carve into it. He shuddered as he watched it. "I still don't think this is an even playing field." Scott looked around in vain for anything that he could use as a weapon, but kept coming up empty. There was a terrible wrenching sound, and the hatch suddenly burst open, the sides of it crashing down onto the deck of the boat. As the creature that was once Brittany forced its way through the small opening, and rose up before them. Her skin, what was left of it, was now a mottled gray color, red and green shell pushed out through certain places, and her mouth was nothing more than a hole filled with tiny claws and tentacle-like feelers. She made an awful chittering sound low in her throat, which was swollen from the lumps of shell and other things that threatened to push through the skin. Her eye stalks pivoted in her still meaty sockets, and the beady black eyes on top glared hatefully at them. "Shit," was all Scott could think to say as she charged them, stabbing out viciously with her clawed hands. They barely dodged out of the way. Scott went down hard, and slammed his already bruised body into the side of the boat with a resounding smack. Ashley smacked the pole hard against the back of the creature. While he doubted it hurt it, the blow threw the creature forward as its many legs were thrown off balance. The pole was now bent back on itself, completely useless to them. He tried to get around the creature as it stumbled back up, and before he knew what was happening, a claw lashed out at him. Jumping back, but not in time, Scott caught a nasty scar across his chest as the creature lashed out again. He fell back heavily on a pile of life jackets, feeling wet and sticky as more of his blood leaked down his chest. With a gulp, he realized that he now had the creature's undivided attention as it moved towards him. Scott reached behind and grabbed around for something to shield himself. His hands came up empty. He closed his eyes as he saw the tip of the claw coming down at him. "This is it," he told himself. "This is how I die." But the claw and the pain never came. Opening his eyes, he saw the claw was now wedged deep inside a life preserver. He didn't know who was more shocked, him or the creature. Before either could recollect their wits, Ashley pushed the bent pole out in front of her and charged the beast, knocking it straight off the side of the boat. Then, running for the console, she pushed the throttle all the way forward, gunned the engine. Tossing Scott back down into the pile of life preservers, he grabbed at the sides as the prow of the boat lifted out of the water and the shot across the ocean. Looking back, he never even saw the creature resurface. Eventually, Ashley brought the boat back down to a manageable speed. In pain, Scott got to his feet, pretty sure that none of his injuries were life-threatening, then walked to join Ashley. "You okay?" Ashley asked him as he took the seat beside her, her eyes staring at the large gashes in his chest and back. He nodded. "Yeah, I'll live." "How did you know that would work?" She grinned at him. "Crabs and lobsters are bottom feeders. I figured it was worth a shot. And it wasn't like we were going to be able to kill it," she added tiredly. He couldn't argue with her. Right then, all Scott wanted was a beer, and to be as far away from the ocean as possible. Epilogue. After the boat ran out of gas, they drifted aimlessly for several hours before a passing patrol helicopter spotted them. The authorities never found the island. Whether they even looked or not, Scott didn't know. There was a brief speculation across several international news outlets, but most of them chalked it up to partying college kids running afoul drug dealers in the Caribbean. They both got plenty of offers to come clean and tell the full story for outrageous amounts of money. But Scott knew that no one was ready for the full story, at least not the one that they had to tell. Scott and Ashley never tried to change the media's mind. After all, it wasn't like anyone wanted to hear the truth. Better for everyone to believe that it was just a regular crime. An awful tragedy, nothing more. They'd both tried not to think about what they'd seen on the island. Taking solace in each other, they left the beach and Caribbean behind as quickly as the authorities would let them, both doing their best to keep the nightmares at bay. Scott woke up screaming most nights, his dreams full of mouths filled with claws and something too big walking across an endless ocean floor, beckoning all who saw it to join it under the waves in places where the light never touched. Even in the abysmal darkness, its shell still glittered, its every step leaving gold and jewels in its wake. Most nights, he reached across the bed and huddled up against the sleeping form of Ashley. She murmured in her sleep and rolled over. Tonight was no different. She woke and murmured in her sleep, "You have another nightmare?" He nodded. Want to go see if the bar's open? She asked him. Sure. He told her and watched as she climbed out of bed and quickly dressed. She caught his eye and laughed. There will be plenty of time for that later, she told him. Right, he fished around for his clothes and almost tripped, putting his legs in his pants. Carefully, he attempted to put on a shirt without busting the stitches in his chest and back. Let me help, Ashley said, walking over and running her hands up his stomach and chest, confusing Scott as to why they were getting dressed in the first place. As she tried to help him put his on, he tried to help her take hers off. She playfully removed his hands. Later, I want a drink. Okay. He murmured into her ear and joined her in the hall of the hotel. His father had decided that they should wait out the media frenzy somewhere else, while his firm handled everything. He'd been far more understanding than Scott would have thought. He believed Scott when his son told him they hadn't been buying drugs, and that it was the wrong place, the wrong time situation. He'd also sent them to Europe in the meantime. The mountains, of course, far away from the ocean as they could get. Even flying over it had been too much for Scott. He was, of course, thrilled that Ashley had agreed to come with him. She'd even brought a map of old mountain hotels she wanted to check out. They'd been to 3 so far, and spent most of their time in bed. The light in the hallway suggested it was daytime. He checked the clock later since both of their sleep cycles had gotten out of whack. But the shrink they talked to online said that was to be expected. It's nice here, Ashley told him as they sat next to an old, roaring stone fireplace, its logs spitting and crackling with the flames. Scott was drinking some sort of mulled wine, and Ashley had gotten the same. Afterwards, they'd probably switch to a stronger cocktail, eat a little and go back to bed. Not that he was complaining. I wonder if my father's firm has any offices out here, he mused, though he knew as well as she did that they couldn't stay there forever. Doubt it, but I wouldn't hate the mountains though. Even in the States. Your wish is my command, he said, and took another sip of his mulled wine. It better be, she said playfully. He was about to say something back when his phone went off. Pulling it out of his pocket, he almost choked when he saw who was calling. Scott, baby, are you okay? Who is it? Ashley asked him. It's Andrew, he all but whispered. Well, that's not possible, she told him, and then, before he could stop her, she answered it. Whoever this isn't funny. She practically growled into the phone, careful not to cause a scene in the hotel bar. Andrew's voice came through loud and clear from the other end of the line. Hello, Ashley. Scott, I'm happy you finally sealed the deal, so to speak. At least I'm guessing you did if you're answering his phone. Andrew, they both said at the same time. Are you okay? Where are you? I'm home. In Wisconsin? Scott asked. But how? Andrew laughed. No, Scott, my true home. The temple of my Lord. Did you see him when he ascended back to his watery domain? They tried to lock him away, they tried to trap him and control him. Their worship wasn't pure, so he took of them their bodies and their minds. But he spared me so that I might serve him in this new eon. Andrew, no, what are you talking about? Scott asked, his heart hammering in his chest. Join me. Come back to the island and your true home. Fulfill your destiny to the Clod Lord. No. Ashley told him and hung up. Why did you do that? He asked her, but one look and he knew no matter how much he wanted to believe he could save him, Andrew was gone. Now all they had was each other. Standing in the ruins of the temple, the priest prepared the way. The seasons would change soon, and while they didn't experience them down here like they did back in North America, the seas knew. The tides changed and the winds changed. Soon the Clawed One would return from the deep and go back into the great caves. It was his way. The last priests had tried to trap him, to lure him where they could profit off of his due sacrifices, and they'd been punished for it. For a while he'd allowed it, but never again would he be lured into such a trap, not even by the faithful. Their bodies now changed. The priest knew they'd never return from the deep. Like the little eaters, they needed the ocean water to live and thrive, and would only come out for food. Luckily for them, all the island would provide. The island always had, and always would give them what they needed. Both worshippers and food for the clod god. The great shelled one, the glitterer. Scythias, the lord of the stars below. The keeper of dead and hidden things. Andrew smiled as he thought about his new lord. All his life he'd wanted a purpose, a true calling. That's why after college he had planned to travel the world. But now he knew that would have been a waste. In the depths of the master's shell, he'd found his calling. He'd gazed deeply into the master's eyes and seen the chasms of the wretched waters where other deep gods had died long ago, the shelled one picking at their bodies and eating them away. And in the process, becoming more than they could ever be. The Swede had planned to kill them, but the Swede had been wrong. He tried to trap the god, to harness his power to use as his own. The Swede hadn't understood what he was dealing with, not truly. In his heart, he feared his god. He was greedy and wrong, so the master had changed him to better serve. In the master, Brittany had seen power. She wanted to be a predator so badly it practically radiated off of her. The master had obliged her. Andrew was happy for her. She'd beamed as she accepted his mark, and became one of the holy crawlers. Andrew only wished she'd been able to bring Scott and Ashley back to share in the glorious bounty, which was the island. Andrew didn't want to be one of the holy crawlers. He was happy just to serve. And through his service he knew too that the master rejoiced. And this was good. He wondered if Scott would return. His phone call had not gone as planned, but he knew it would take time for Ashley and him to accept the gifts they were being offered. But in the meantime, Andrew needed to prepare the island and welcome any who found their way to it, because soon his lord would return and he would demand his bounty as was his right. Andrew wanted to make sure that his lord's altar was overflowing with sacrifices. Willingly or not.